My name is Whitney, 35 years old, and I never told my parents I was a federal judge. To them, I was just the family dropout. When my golden child sister hit a man with her car, my mother grabbed my shoulders and told me to take the blame. My father said I had nothing to lose since her political campaign was more important than my life. My sister just smiled and asked who would ever believe me anyway. That was the last mistake she ever made. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to serve justice to a toxic family member. The rain was coming down in sheets that Tuesday night, hitting the windows of my modest downtown apartment like gravel. I had just finished reviewing a complex stack of federal case files, relishing the quiet peace of my living room. I poured myself a hot cup of chamomile tea, looking forward to a rare evening of uninterrupted rest. My life over the past 5 years had been built on this kind of quiet stability, a deliberate counter to the chaotic status-obsessed world I had left behind. Then, my personal cell phone began to vibrate across the kitchen island. I glanced at the glowing screen and felt my stomach drop. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen illuminate my phone in half a decade. Susan, my mother. 5 years of absolute radio silence had passed since the day my parents packed my bags and told me a public service desk job was a disgrace to the family name. I had walked away from a highly lucrative position at a ruthless corporate law firm to work as a public defender, a choice they viewed as a personal insult to my father's real estate empire. They cut me off completely, declaring me a failure. Yet here she was calling me at 10 o'clock on a torrential Tuesday night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the decline button, but a strange instinct urged me to answer. When I brought the phone to my ear, the voice on the other end was entirely unrecognizable. It was stripped of its usual country club polish, devoid of the arrogant superiority my mother wore like armor. She was breathless, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, high-pitched panic. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing after 5 years of estrangement. She simply commanded me to come to the estate immediately. I asked her what was wrong, trying to keep my own voice steady and calm. She refused to explain. She just repeated that there had been a terrible emergency, that I needed to get there right now, and then the line went dead. The drive took 40 minutes through the relentless downpour. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy rain as I navigated the winding tree-lined roads up toward the wealthy enclaves where my parents lived. My mind raced through a dozen different scenarios. Thomas, my father, had a history of high blood pressure and an explosive temper. Perhaps his heart had finally given out. Chelsea, my younger sister by 2 years, was in the middle of a vicious, highly publicized campaign for the state senate. She was the golden child, the ruthless, charismatic daughter who viewed people as disposable tools for her own ambition. Maybe the pressure of the campaign had finally caused a spectacular meltdown. But the sheer, unadulterated terror in my mother's voice felt different. It felt dangerous. I reached the massive wrought iron gates of the family estate. They were already wide open, an unusual and glaring breach of my father's strict security protocols. I drove my unassuming sedan up the long, curving driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness and the heavy sheets of rain. The estate loomed ahead, a massive stone structure that had always felt more like a museum meant for public admiration than an actual home. But my attention was instantly stolen away from the grand architecture. Sitting in the middle of the circular driveway was Chelsea's luxury silver SUV. It was parked haphazardly, sitting diagonally, with two of its large wheels resting heavily on the perfectly manicured front lawn. The driver's side door was left wide open to the pouring rain, and the headlights were still blazing, casting a harsh, glaring light against the stone facade of the house. I shifted my car into park, my judicial instincts immediately taking over. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped out into the freezing rain, my coat instantly soaked through. I walked slowly toward my sister's vehicle, the sound of the storm roaring in my ears. As I rounded the front of the SUV, I stopped dead in my tracks. The front passenger side of the vehicle was completely caved in. The expensive headlight assembly was shattered, leaving jagged shards of thick plastic and glass scattered across the wet paving stones. The heavy metal bumper was crumpled backward, indicating a severe impact at a high rate of speed. But the structural damage was not the worst part. I stepped closer, the cold rain mixing with a sudden cold sweat breaking out across my skin. There was a dark, smeared stain stretching across the dented silver hood. Even in the dim, chaotic lighting, even with the heavy rain washing over the metal, I knew exactly what it was. It was blood. A thick, horrifying smear of it. I leaned in closer, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Caught deep inside the cracked front grille was a piece of torn dark fabric soaked and clinging to the shattered plastic. This was not a fender bender. This was not a collision with a deer or a stray animal. This was catastrophic. My sister had hit a human being. I turned away from the gruesome sight, my mind rapidly calculating the legal and moral implications of what was sitting in my parents' driveway. I marched up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy oak front doors without bothering to knock. The grand foyer, usually perfectly staged to impress wealthy guests and political donors, felt charged with a frantic, suffocating energy. The sound of my father's heavy footsteps echoed from the formal living room down the hall, accompanied by the frantic, hushed tones of my mother's voice. I walked into the living room, dripping rainwater onto the pristine, imported marble floors. Thomas was pacing back and forth in front of the massive stone fireplace like a caged animal. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, and he was muttering violently into his cell phone, his usual arrogant composure completely shattered. Susan was wringing her hands nearby, her expensive designer silk blouse wrinkled and stained with rainwater. She was pacing a few steps behind him, looking like a woman on the verge of a total psychological collapse. And then there was Chelsea, my 33-year-old sister, the pride of the family, the future state senator. While our parents were consumed by panic, Chelsea was sitting perfectly still in the center of the plush velvet sofa. Her legs were elegantly crossed at the ankles. She was holding a large crystal glass of expensive red wine, the dark liquid swirling gently as she took a slow, measured sip. She looked completely unfazed by the storm raging outside or the undeniable evidence of violence dripping from the grille of her car. Her makeup was flawless, her designer dress impeccable. She slowly lowered the wine glass and looked at me. Her eyes were cold, hollow, and fiercely calculating. As she took in my soaking wet practical coat and my bewildered expression, a slow, chilling smirk spread across her face. The trap had already been set, and I had just walked right through the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous living room. For a split second, the frantic energy in the room ground to an absolute halt. My father stopped his angry pacing, his phone lowering from his ear. My mother whipped her head around, her eyes wide and wild. Even Chelsea paused with her wine glass halfway to her lips. Then, like a dam breaking, my mother lunged forward. She crossed the distance between us in 3 frantic strides. Her hands, adorned with heavy diamond rings, shot out and clamped down hard on my wet shoulders. Her grip was tight enough to bruise. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not apologize for the 5 years of brutal silence that preceded this moment. Her eyes darted frantically toward the large windows facing the driveway, then back to my face. "You are here!" She gasped, her breath smelling faintly of gin and sheer panic. "Thank God you are here. Listen to me very carefully. The police are going to be coming soon. When they get here, you just need to tell them you were driving the SUV." The words hit me with the physical force of a concrete wall. I stared at her, the rain dripping from my hair and sliding down the bridge of my nose. My brain, usually trained to process complex legal arguments in fractions of a second, completely stalled. I looked from my mother's terrified face to my father's stern, expectant glare, and finally to my sister, who was watching the scene unfold with mild amusement. "Excuse me," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached up and firmly shoved my mother's hands off my shoulders. "What did you just say to me?" Susan stepped forwards again, her voice rising to a shrill, demanding pitch. "There is no time to argue with me, Whitney. Chelsea had a little accident tonight. It was pouring rain. The visibility was terrible, and someone stepped right out in front of her car. It could have happened to anyone. But she panicked and drove home. We do not have time to fix the narrative before the authorities arrive. You just need to say you borrowed her car." You need to tell them you were behind the wheel when the accident happened. She hit a pedestrian. I said, the reality of the bloody caved-in bumper settling heavily into my stomach. I turned my burning gaze to my sister, my blood running ice cold. You hit a human being and you drove away. Did you even stop to call an ambulance? Did you check to see if they were alive? Chelsea let out a long, dramatic sigh, shifting her weight on the velvet cushions. She took another slow sip of her wine before setting the crystal glass on the expensive glass coffee table. "Do not be so dramatic, Whitney," she said, her tone dripping with the same condescension she had used when we were teenagers. It was dark. He came out of nowhere. I am sure someone else found him on the road. If I had stayed there waiting for the cops, the press would have been all over it in 10 minutes. I am 6 weeks away from the primary election. A scandal like this right now would completely destroy my campaign. I felt physically ill. My sister was sitting in a warm, dry living room worrying about poll numbers while someone she struck with a 2-ton vehicle was potentially bleeding to death on the wet pavement. Your campaign. I repeated, my voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of absolute disgust and rising fury. A person might be dead. Chelsea. You committed a felony hit and run, and you are sitting there whining about your political career. "Do not speak to your sister that way," my father barked, stepping into the center of the room. Thomas was a man who commanded every space he occupied. I was used to barking orders at construction foremen and city planners, throwing money at problems until they disappeared. He looked me up and down, his eyes taking in my plain, soaked trench coat and sensible flat shoes, with undisguised contempt. Chelsea is going to be the next state senator. She has a bright future ahead of her. She has donors. She has influence. She has people depending on her leadership. A police investigation right now would be a disaster for this family. He stepped closer to me, trying to use his height to intimidate me, just as he had done when I was 20 years old and begging for his support. "Look at you," he sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You threw your life away, Whitney. You had a chance to work at a top-tier corporate law firm. You had a chance to actually make something of yourself. Instead, you dropped out to work some pathetic low-level government desk job. You disappeared for 5 years and did absolutely nothing with your potential. You chose to be a failure." I stood perfectly still, letting his cruel words wash over me. They did not know. Because of my strict insistence on privacy and my complete detachment from their social circles, they had absolutely no idea what I had been doing for the past 5 years. They did not know about my rapid ascent through the justice system. They did not know about the federal appointment. To Thomas and Susan, public service was synonymous with failure. In their eyes, because I was not making millions in corporate law or running for public office, my life had zero value. "Chelsea has everything to lose tonight," my father continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, demanding register. "You have nothing to lose. You have no career, no reputation, no public standing. If you take the fall for this, it will just be a tragic accident committed by a struggling woman. I will hire the best defense attorneys in the state. I will pay the victim's family whatever settlement they want. You might get a little probation, maybe a suspended sentence. We will cover all your legal fees and give you a fresh start. But Chelsea's name stays entirely out of it." "It is the least you can do," my mother added, stepping to my father's side to present a united front. She crossed her arms, looking at me as if I were an ungrateful child throwing a tantrum over a toy. "We gave you everything growing up, Whitney. We paid for your undergraduate degree. We gave you a beautiful home, and you paid us back by embarrassing us and walking away. It is time for you to finally step up and do something for your family. You owe us this sacrifice." I looked over at Chelsea. She was picking at her perfectly manicured fingernails, looking profoundly bored by the entire conversation. She truly believed that my life was a disposable commodity, something to be traded away, simply to keep her political ambitions intact. They were asking me to confess to a violent crime. They were asking me to risk prison time to destroy my own record simply because they deemed my existence less valuable than hers. The sheer audacity of their demand was breathtaking. They were trying to orchestrate a massive criminal cover-up right in front of me. They wanted me to lie to the police, obstruct a major investigation, and pervert the course of justice. They were speaking to a sitting federal judge, demanding she commit perjury and obstruction of justice to save a corrupt politician. The irony was so thick, I could practically taste it in the back of my throat. I stared at the three of them, absorbing the absolute toxicity that had defined my entire childhood. "You are insane," I said, my voice eerily calm, despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "All of you have completely lost your minds. I am not taking the blame for a crime I did not commit. I am not lying to the police. Chelsea got behind the wheel of that car. Chelsea hit that person. Chelsea chose to drive away and leave them in the street. She needs to face the consequences of her own actions. I am not throwing myself under the bus to save a coward." My sister's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing with sudden vicious anger. My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, as if I had physically struck her. But my father did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked dangerously calm. The kind of calm he always displayed right before he closed a ruthless business deal or destroyed a competitor. He slowly walked over to the heavy oak desk in the corner of the living room, opening the top drawer with slow, deliberate movements. The trap had deeper layers, and I was about to find out exactly how far they had gone. My father pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from the desk drawer and placed it flat on the mahogany surface. Before he could speak, the heavy sliding doors opened, and Jason walked in. Jason was Chelsea's fiancé and the chief manager of her political campaign. He was a man who wore expensive custom-tailored suits that always looked a little too tight, projecting an image of aggressive corporate success. How was the family fixer, the guy who made parking tickets disappear, intimidated local journalists, and handled all the unsavory details my father preferred not to touch? Jason walked over to the desk, picked up the piece of paper, and crossed the room toward me. He moved with a slick, practiced confidence. He stopped just a few feet away, invading my personal space, and held out the paper. It was a printed document formatted cleanly. I did not take it from his hand. I just stared at the stark black text. It was a fully drafted confession. It detailed a fabricated story about how I had borrowed my sister's vehicle because mine had broken down, how the heavy rain had impaired my visibility, and how I had panicked after feeling a sudden impact on the dark coastal highway. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction, carefully wording the events to minimize the potential charges, while squarely placing the entirety of the blame on my shoulders. Jason stood there holding the confession, a sickeningly smooth smile spreading across his face. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be, Whitney," Jason said, his voice dropping into a patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. He spoke to me as if he were trying to negotiate a settlement with a desperate, uneducated plaintiff. "We all know you are struggling. Your mother told me you are still living in that tiny apartment downtown, working some dead-end job that barely covers your basic living expenses." Jason took a step closer, waving the paper slightly to catch my attention. "Here is the deal. You sign this document right now. You read it to the police when they get here. In exchange, I will personally write you a check tomorrow morning to cover your rent for an entire year. I will even throw in enough extra cash for you to buy yourself a decent used car. Think about it. You get a whole year of financial freedom, and all you have to do is take a little bit of heat for an accident that anyone could have made. It is a win for everybody." I stared at him, absolutely mesmerized by the staggering arrogance of his proposition. He was offering me a year of rent in a cheap apartment in exchange for a felony conviction. He was attempting to bribe a federal judge to obstruct a major criminal investigation, and he was doing it with the casual, breezy attitude of someone haggling over the price of a used television. The legal ramifications were staggering. Conspiracy, bribery, obstruction of justice, subornation of perjury. The list of federal offenses stacking up in this living room was enough to put every single one of them behind bars for a very long time. I did not laugh. I did not yell. I looked Jason dead in the eyes and slapped the piece of paper out of his hand. It fluttered to the marble floor, landing near my soaked shoes. "Keep your filthy money, Jason," I said, my voice cutting through the tense air like shattered glass. "I do not want your handouts. I do not need your charity. And I am absolutely not signing a fraudulent confession to save your political meal ticket." I turned away from him, disgusted by the sight of his slick, smiling face, and looked back at my parents. "This conversation is over. I am leaving right now. When the police show up to investigate the blood and shattered grill in your driveway, you can tell them whatever lies you want. But if they come to my apartment asking questions, I will tell them the absolute truth. I will tell them exactly what I saw and exactly what you tried to bribe me into doing tonight. Good luck with the campaign, Chelsea. You will need a fantastic defense attorney. I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand foyer. My heart pounded a steady drumbeat against my ribs, but my steps were measured. I reached the heavy front door, my hand closing firmly around the cold handle. I was ready to walk out into the freezing rain to leave this toxic nightmare forever and make a secure phone call to the United States Attorney's Office the second I was safely inside my car. But before I could turn the handle, my father's voice echoed through the foyer. It was a cold, hard statement of absolute control that stopped me in my tracks. "You are not going anywhere," Whitney Thomas said softly, his heavy footsteps moving slowly across the marble floor until he stood just a few feet behind me. "Because if you walk out that door right now and tell the police Chelsea was driving that car, they are going to arrest you anyway." I slowly released the brass handle and turned to face him. He stood with his hands clasped casually behind his back, looking at me with an expression of untouchable authority. My mother had stopped crying. She stood next to the fireplace, her arms crossed tight, watching me with a hardened, calculating gaze. "What are you talking about?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "I was sitting in my apartment reading when this happened. I have alibis. I have security cameras in my building. I have a digital trail proving I was nowhere near this estate or that vehicle. The police have no reason to suspect me." My father let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You really think I would ask you to take the fall without making sure you were already implicated?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "You really think I am that careless?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of thick paper, tossing it onto the entry table. It was a registration card. "You see, when Chelsea bought that luxury SUV 3 years ago, her driving record was a complete disaster. She had 2 prior DUIs, we paid a lot of money to make disappear, and her insurance premiums were astronomical. It was bad for her public image, so I took care of it. I registered the vehicle under your name. I forged your signature on the title documents. As far as the state is concerned, that bloody SUV sitting in my driveway belongs entirely to you." I stared at the small piece of paper on the table, the breath knocked out of my lungs. My father had stolen my identity and committed federal fraud just to save his golden child some money on car insurance. He had legally tied me to a 2-ton weapon without my knowledge. Chelsea finally stood up from the velvet sofa. She walked slowly toward the foyer, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the floor. She stopped next to my father, looking at me with a triumphant, malicious smile. She pulled a damp microfiber cloth from her pocket, dropping it next to the registration. "I just spent the last 20 minutes wiping down the steering wheel, the door handles, and the gear shift," Chelsea said, her voice bright and cheerful. "There is not a single fingerprint of mine left inside that vehicle. The only person connected to that car is you. So go ahead, call the police, tell them your story. But when they run the plates, they are going to see your name. When they look at the evidence, they are going to see your car. You have already been framed." Their betrayal settled over me like a blanket. They had not just asked me to take the fall. They had built a steel cage around me, locked the door, and handed me the blame. The silence in the grand foyer was suffocating. I stared at the small piece of paper resting on the entry table, the registration card that tied my name to a violent crime I did not commit. My mind, trained by years of rigorous legal analysis, quickly categorized the exact statutes my family had just violated: forgery, identity theft, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of a criminal investigation. They had not simply panicked in the aftermath of a terrible accident. They had systematically manufactured a scapegoat, carefully constructing a trap designed to sacrifice my freedom to preserve the political ambitions of my sister. I looked at the 4 faces staring back at me. My father standing tall and utterly unrepentant, viewing my destruction as a necessary business transaction. My mother, her posture relaxing now that the ugly reality of her golden child committing a crime had been successfully shifted onto my shoulders. Jason leaning against the archway with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, entirely confident that his dirty work had secured his ticket to the state capitol. And Chelsea, my sister, watching me with cold, calculating eyes, already wiping the memory of the bleeding pedestrian from her conscience. If I continued to fight them right now, if I pushed back and threatened to call the police from this very room, my father would escalate. He would lock the doors. He would physically prevent me from leaving. He would ensure that the local police chief, a man whose election campaign he heavily funded, arrived to arrest me on the spot, with the forged evidence already perfectly positioned. I was in the belly of the beast, surrounded by accomplices who controlled the narrative in this wealthy town. I could not act like the federal judge in this moment. I needed to act exactly like the person they believed I was. A desperate, broke, terrified failure who had no other options. I let my shoulders slump forward. I relaxed the firm, commanding posture I used in the courtroom and allowed my body to visibly tremble. I looked down at my wet, cheap shoes, forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. When I finally looked back up at my father, I made sure my eyes were wide with manufactured panic. "How could you do this to me?" I asked, letting my voice crack perfectly on the last word. "How could you put my name on that car without telling me?" My father let out a heavy sigh, the sound of a man inconvenienced by a whining child. "Do not play the victim, Whitney. We pay the insurance premiums. We paid for the vehicle. Your name on the paperwork was merely a logistical necessity. And frankly, it is incredibly fortunate that we made that arrangement. It makes this entire process much cleaner." I wrapped my arms around my waist, hugging myself as if I were freezing. I turned my gaze to Jason, projecting pure pathetic desperation. "If I do this," I stammered, biting my lower lip to complete the performance. "If I take the blame for the accident, you promise you will pay for my lawyers. You promise I will not go to prison." Jason chuckled, pushing himself off the doorframe and strolling back toward me. He reached out and condescendingly patted my wet shoulder. "Do not worry about a thing, sweetheart. I know the best defense attorneys in the entire state. We will get you a plea deal so sweet you will barely even notice you have a record. You will probably just get a little community service, maybe some probation. And like I said, your rent is covered for a year. You will not have to worry about a thing." I looked down at the marble floor, letting a long, defeated silence stretch between us. I needed them to believe that the fight had completely drained out of me. I needed them to feel absolute certainty of victory. "Okay," I whispered, keeping my head bowed. "Okay, I will do it. I will say I was driving." My mother let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She stepped forward and reached out to touch my arm, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of maternal gratitude. "Oh, Whitney, thank you. I knew you would do the right thing for this family. I knew you would not let the future of your sister be destroyed over a silly mistake. We are so proud of you for stepping up." I fought the urge to violently pull away from her touch. Instead, I gave a weak, pathetic nod. "But I cannot do it right this second," I said, looking back up at my father with wide, pleading eyes. "I need some time. I need 24 hours to get my affairs in order." My father frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in immediate suspicion. "Time for what?" "You do not have an empire to manage. You just need to sign the paper, and we will call the authorities to arrange a controlled surrender." I shook my head frantically, playing the role of a disorganized, anxious mess. "I have to tell my landlord what is going on. I have to call my boss at the government office and tell them I need a leave of absence. If I just disappear into police custody tonight, I will lose my job. I will lose everything I have built. Please. I just need one day to pack some things and explain to my boss that I am having a personal crisis. I will come back tomorrow night and sign whatever you want me to sign." Chelsea let out a loud, mocking laugh. She walked over to the entry table and picked up the forged registration, waving it dismissively. "Let her have her 24 hours, Dad. It is not like she has anywhere important to be or anyone important to see. What is she going to do? Run away? Let her go pack her little bags and call her pathetic boss. She knows she cannot run from this. The car is in her name. The evidence is right outside." Jason nodded in agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. "She is right, Thomas. Let her go home and panic for a day. It will make her more compliant when we bring the lawyers in tomorrow. Besides, it gives me time to properly grease the wheels at the precinct. I want to make sure the booking officer knows exactly how to handle this, so the press does not catch wind of a Wilson family arrest before we control the narrative." My father stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He was calculating the risks, weighing his absolute control over my life against the possibility of my rebellion. He looked at my soaked, shivering frame, my slumped shoulders, and my tear-filled eyes. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a broken woman who had finally accepted her place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. "Fine," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "You have 24 hours. You go home. You call your little boss. You pack a bag with whatever cheap clothes you need for the holding cell. But you listen to me very carefully, Whitney. You will be back in this living room tomorrow night at exactly 8 o'clock. If you are not standing right here ready to sign that confession, I will call the police chief myself. I will tell him that my estranged, troubled daughter stole her sister's vehicle in a drunken rage and ran down a pedestrian. I will make sure they do not just arrest you. I will make sure they destroy you. Do we understand each other?" I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the ground. "I understand. I will be here tomorrow night." "Good," my mother said, brushing a stray piece of lint off her silk blouse. "Now go home and get cleaned up. You are dripping water all over the imported marble. It is completely unsanitary." I turned around without saying another single solitary word to them. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door and pulled it open, stepping back out into the freezing torrential rain. The storm had not let up at all tonight. The wind whipped my wet winter coat around my legs as I walked slowly down the wide stone steps. I kept my head down, my posture completely defeated, knowing that 4 pairs of eyes were burning into my back from the warmth of the grand foyer. I walked past the smashed silver SUV, not allowing myself to look at the blood-stained grille. I reached my unassuming sedan, opened the door, and slid into the cold driver's seat. I started the engine, my hands shaking violently as I gripped the steering wheel. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the house, navigating the long, winding, slippery driveway toward the massive, dark wrought iron security gates. The moment my rear bumper cleared the wrought iron gates, they began to swing shut behind me with a heavy metallic clang that was swallowed by the storm. I drove exactly 1 mile down the winding, tree-lined suburban road before I pulled my sedan onto the gravel shoulder, killing the headlights. The rain continued to batter the roof of my car in a deafening rhythm. I put the vehicle in park, took my hands off the steering wheel, and let out a long, slow breath. The violent shaking in my hands instantly ceased. The manufactured tears dried on my cheeks. The terrified, pathetic, broken daughter my family so eagerly wanted to see simply vanished into the cold night air. In her place sat the Honorable Judge Whitney of the United States District Court. I reached into the center console of my car and retrieved my secondary cell phone. It was a heavily encrypted device issued for federal judicial business, protected by secure authentication and reserved for official communications. My mind was no longer clouded by the emotional shock of their betrayal. I was operating purely on statute, jurisdiction, and procedure. My father thought he was dealing with a naive dropout who could be easily intimidated by a forged piece of paper and a smug campaign manager. He had no idea he had just handed a detailed map of a massive criminal conspiracy directly to a federal judge. I dialed a private number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. All the voice said. "Paul, it is Whitney," I said, keeping my voice low and controlled. "I need to report an immediate threat and a developing criminal conspiracy. I am one of the intended victims and a likely witness, so I cannot direct the investigation. I need this routed through the duty supervisor and handled independently." Paul Henderson was an assistant United States attorney, one of the sharpest prosecutors in the district, and a trusted colleague who had appeared in my courtroom on complex corruption matters. His tone changed at once. "Tell me only what you personally saw, heard, or were shown," he said. "I will notify the criminal division and the appropriate federal investigators. Any search warrant, seizure order, or surveillance authorization will go through an independent judge. You stay in the role of witness." I told him about the hit and run, the smashed SUV, the blood on the grill, and the demand that I falsely confess. I described the registration card Thomas had shown me and his admission that he had forged my signature years earlier. I repeated Jason's offer to cover my rent and legal fees if I accepted blame, and I explained the family's claim that the local police chief could be controlled through money and political influence. Paul went quiet for a moment. "That is enough to open an emergency review," he said. "Do not touch the SUV, the registration, or anything they may have staged. Do not confront them again unless investigators tell you it is safe. If they contact you, preserve every message and every recording you can lawfully make as a participant in the conversation. I will have agents verify the registration history, the notary records, the vehicle evidence, and the local corruption allegations. If the facts support warrants, prosecutors will apply for them through a judge who has no connection to you or your family." "They gave me 24 hours," I said. "They expect me to return tomorrow and sign a prepared confession." "Then let them believe you are considering it," Paul replied. "Do not promise anything beyond what you need to stay safe. We will build this from evidence, not from your title." That was exactly what I needed to hear. For the first time since entering my parents' estate, the line between my personal fury and my professional duty became perfectly clear. I would not prosecute my family. I would not issue orders in their case. I would document what they did to me, protect the evidence, and let independent federal investigators and prosecutors do the rest. "I will cooperate," I said. "Send me the secure instructions." "You will have them within minutes, Your Honor," Paul replied. "And Whitney, from this point forward, treat yourself as a witness under threat, not as the judge in charge of the case." I ended the call and placed the encrypted phone back into the center console. The legal machinery was now in motion. My family thought they controlled the board, completely oblivious to the fact that they were playing checkers against a grandmaster in chess. But the law was only one half of the equation. There was a human cost to Chelsea's arrogant negligence, and I needed to know the extent of the damage she had caused. I pulled my car back onto the wet asphalt and drove toward the only major trauma center in the county. The hospital was a sprawling, brightly lit complex that stood in stark contrast to the dark, stormy night. I parked in the back of the visitor structure, pulling the collar of my trench coat up and keeping my head down as I walked through the sliding glass doors of the emergency department. The waiting room was sparse at this hour, smelling heavily of antiseptic and stale coffee. I approached the triage desk, adopting the posture of a concerned, exhausted citizen. "Excuse me," I said to the nurse behind the plexiglass, keeping my voice low and polite. "I am looking for a pedestrian who was brought in earlier tonight. He was struck by a vehicle out on the coastal highway. I witnessed the aftermath, and I just wanted to make sure he survived." The nurse looked at me with tired, sympathetic eyes. She typed a few keys on her computer, her expression turning grim. "Are you a family member?" "No," I answered honestly. "Just a concerned bystander. The storm was so bad and it looked terrible. He is in the intensive care unit," the nurse said softly, lowering her voice to maintain confidentiality. "I cannot give you any specific medical details, but I can tell you he is in critical condition. It was a severe trauma impact." "Did they catch the driver?" she added, shaking her head in disgust. "Whoever hit him did not even hit the brakes, just left him there in the rain." "No," I murmured, my jaw clenching so hard my teeth ached. "They have not caught the driver yet. Do you know his name?" "David," she replied softly. "That is all I can say." I thanked the nurse and walked away from the desk, my stomach twisting into tight, painful knots. I bypassed the main waiting area and slipped into a quiet, dimly lit corridor that led toward the surgical waiting rooms. I did not need to press the staff for more information. I knew how to navigate hospitals without drawing attention. I took the elevator to the intensive care floor, staying close to the walls and keeping my head down. The ICU waiting area was completely empty, except for two figures sitting huddled together on a small vinyl couch in the corner. I stopped in the shadows of the hallway, my heart aching as I watched them. It was an older woman, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, with her arm wrapped protectively around a young girl who could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The little girl was clutching a stuffed bear, her small shoulders shaking with silent, terrified sobs. A doctor in pale blue scrubs walked out of a nearby set of double doors and approached them. The older woman stood up immediately, her hands clasped together in desperate prayer. I could not hear the exact words the doctor was saying, but I could read the devastating body language, the heavy, sympathetic nod, the gentle hand placed on the older woman's shoulder, the grim, serious expression that indicated a long, difficult fight ahead. The older woman collapsed back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, while the little girl buried her face in the woman's side. David was a father. He was a father fighting for his life in a sterile hospital room, his body shattered because my sister decided a human life was worth less than a dent in her political polling numbers. While Chelsea was sitting on a velvet sofa, sipping expensive red wine, and complaining about the inconvenience of it all, this little girl was sitting in a freezing hospital waiting room, terrified that she was about to lose her father. A hot white wave of pure rage washed over me. It was not the chaotic defensive anger I had felt when my parents tried to force me into a false confession. It was a cold, precise, deeply focused fury. For 5 years I had maintained my distance from my family, believing that avoiding their toxicity was enough. I had convinced myself that their arrogance and their greed only affected the elite, superficial circles they moved in. I was wrong. Their absolute belief that they were above the law, their conviction that their wealth could erase any consequence, had finally resulted in innocent blood being spilled on the pavement. I stood in the shadows of the hospital corridor, burning the image of that crying little girl into my memory. My father had told me I had nothing to lose. He was absolutely right, but not in the way he thought. I had no loyalty left to lose. I had no illusions about my family left to shatter. They had stripped away every last ounce of familial obligation I might have harbored, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard mechanics of justice. I turned around and walked back toward the elevator, my flat shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum floor. I was going to let Jason come to my apartment tomorrow. I was going to let my parents invite me into their home. I was going to let them spin their web of lies and extortion, and I was going to document every single agonizing second of it. They thought they were framing a disposable scapegoat. They had no idea they had just declared war on a federal judge who was about to systematically dismantle their entire empire brick by bloody brick. I walked out into the cold, rainy night, my resolve hardening into solid steel. Tomorrow the trap they thought they set for me was going to snap shut on their own necks. After leaving the hospital, I drove back to my apartment on the working-class side of the city. The torrential rain from earlier had finally slowed to a cold, persistent drizzle, leaving the streets slick and empty. I purposefully chose this modest brick walk-up 5 years ago when I first took my public service job, and I kept it even after my appointment to the federal bench. To my family, living in a building with no doorman and peeling paint in the hallway was the ultimate proof of my total failure in life. To me, it was the perfect camouflage. My federal salary could easily afford a luxury penthouse overlooking the city's skyline, but I preferred the absolute anonymity of a quiet neighborhood where people worked hard and minded their own business. I stepped inside my apartment and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The space was meticulously clean, furnished with simple, high-quality pieces that did not draw any unnecessary attention. But behind the minimalist decor lay a state-of-the-art security system installed by federal contractors. Because of the high-profile cases I handled, my residence required top-tier surveillance. Tiny high-definition cameras were embedded in the smoke detectors, seamlessly integrated into the living room bookshelf, and hidden perfectly behind the dark glass of the kitchen wall clock. I walked over to my laptop on the dining table and pulled up the encrypted security feed. Every angle of the apartment was perfectly illuminated on the screen. I left the system running and went to bed, forcing my exhausted body to get a few hours of sleep. I knew someone from the family would come to check on my compliance today. Jason was exactly the kind of man who enjoyed kicking people when they were down. The heavy, demanding knock on my door came just after 1 in the afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a cup of black coffee, and reviewing secure federal case files on my encrypted tablet. I quickly locked the screen, shoved the tablet under a stack of grocery store flyers, and walked slowly to the door. I hunched my shoulders slightly, arranging my features into a carefully constructed mask of anxious dread, and pulled the door open. Jason stood in the hallway wearing a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the scuffed linoleum floor of the corridor. He held a sleek leather briefcase in one hand and a large, heavy-looking canvas tote bag in the other. He did not bother asking for permission to enter. He pushed right past me, bringing the strong, overpowering scent of expensive cologne into my small living room. I closed the door, wrapping my arms tightly around my waist in a defensive posture. Jason took his time examining my apartment. His eyes swept over the basic furniture, the small television, and the compact kitchen with undisguised contempt. A smug, deeply satisfied sneer curled his lips. He was completely buying the illusion of my pathetic existence. "You know, Whitney," he said, dropping his briefcase onto my coffee table with a heavy thud. "When Thomas told me you lived in a dump, I actually thought he was exaggerating. But this place is genuinely depressing. It smells like cheap cleaning supplies and desperation." I shifted my weight, looking down at the floor to avoid meeting his eyes. "Why are you here, Jason?" "I told my parents I just needed a day to figure things out before I came back tonight." Jason chuckled, setting the heavy canvas tote bag gently on the floor next to the sofa. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and placed his hands on his hips, projecting dominance. "I am here to make sure you truly understand the gravity of the situation. Your father is a very generous man, Whitney. He is offering you a golden parachute out of this miserable little life you have built for yourself. A year of free rent. Your legal fees paid in full by the best attorneys money can buy. But we need to make absolutely sure you do not get cold feet before tonight." I looked up at him, widening my eyes to feign panic. "I already said I would sign the confession. Why do you keep pushing me?" "Because people panic," Jason replied, taking a slow, calculated step toward me. "People start thinking about the long-term consequences of a felony record, and they get scared. Chelsea has a highly sensitive political campaign running right now. Her polling numbers are flawless. We cannot afford any last-minute changes of heart from the family disappointment. So I came here to explain exactly what will happen if you do not walk through those front doors tonight and do exactly what you are told to do." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a smooth, threatening purr. "If you try to back out, or if you try to go to the police with some wild fabricated story about Chelsea driving that SUV, we have a backup plan ready to go." I took a step backward, letting my shoulder blades hit the wall to emphasize my supposed fear. "What backup plan?" Jason smiled, his bright white teeth flashing in the dim light of the apartment. "We have already prepared a very compelling narrative for the press and the local police department. It is a sad, tragic story about a disgraced former corporate lawyer who could not handle the intense pressure of the real world. A unstable woman who completely alienated her loving, supportive family, fell into a deep, dark spiral of depression, and developed a severe, unmanageable alcohol addiction." I shook my head, projecting frantic disbelief. "Nobody is going to believe that. I do not even drink. My entire record is completely clean." Jason laughed out loud, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the small walls. "It does not matter what you actually do, Whitney. It only matters what we can prove you do. We have already drafted statements from people who are more than willing to testify that they saw you drinking heavily at local dive bars. We have medical professionals on the family payroll ready to validate a long history of substance abuse. And best of all, we have the physical evidence to tie the entire narrative together perfectly." He turned away from me and walked over to the canvas tote bag he had left on the floor. He picked it up by the bottom handles and walked straight into my small kitchen. I followed him, my heart hammering a steady, powerful rhythm of pure judicial outrage beneath my ribs. Jason lifted the bag over the kitchen counter and tipped it upside down. A loud, clattering crash echoed through the apartment as over a dozen empty glass bottles spilled out onto the counter and rolled heavily into the stainless steel sink. Vodka, cheap whiskey, imported bourbon. The harsh, stinging smell of stale alcohol instantly filled the room, making my eyes water. I stared at the mess, my jaw dropping in a perfectly orchestrated display of horror. Jason picked up one of the empty vodka bottles and casually tossed it into my open trash can. He kicked another empty whiskey bottle under the kitchen table, letting it roll against the baseboards. He was systematically, deliberately staging a crime scene right inside my home. "The police will find this extremely compelling," he said, dusting his hands off as if he had just completed a hard day of honest manual labor. "A deeply depressed alcoholic woman gets behind the wheel of her own car, hits an innocent pedestrian on the dark coastal highway, and then comes home to drink away the terrible guilt. When the local police chief sends his boys over here to arrest you later this week, they are going to find a textbook drunk driving suspect. And since the car is already registered in your name, your wild, baseless accusations against a promising political candidate like Chelsea will just look like the desperate ravings of a pathetic, jealous drunk. I let out a ragged, trembling breath, bringing my hands up to cover my mouth. "You are framing me twice," I whispered, making absolutely certain the hidden microphone embedded in the wall clock caught every single syllable of my manufactured distress. Jason walked back into the living room and casually picked up his expensive leather briefcase. "We are just ensuring a smooth transaction, Whitney. We prefer the easy way. You come over, you sign the paper, we pay your rent, and you get a tiny slap on the wrist, with our expensive lawyers holding your hand the entire time. But if you try to fight us, we take the hard way. We let the police raid this apartment. They find all these empty bottles. We release the witness statements to the press. You go to state prison for years, and we make absolutely sure the media paints you as an irredeemable monster. The choice is entirely up to you." I stared at him, letting a single dramatic tear slip down my cheek. The performance was completely flawless. He felt entirely in control of my destiny. "I will be there tonight," I said, my voice barely an audible whisper. "I will sign the confession for Chelsea." Jason offered a slick, deeply satisfied nod. "Good girl. See, I knew you had a little bit of common sense left in that empty head of yours. Wear something presentable tonight. Chelsea is having a campaign photographer stop by earlier in the evening, and we do not want you ruining the aesthetic before we get down to business. Do not be late." He turned around, opened my front door, and walked out into the hallway without ever looking back. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the sudden silence of my apartment. I stood perfectly still for a full minute, listening intently to the sound of his expensive leather shoes fading down the concrete stairwell. The moment the building front door slammed shut on the ground floor, my trembling ceased completely. I lowered my hands from my face. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back to release the heavy tension of playing the victim. The smell of cheap liquor was pungent and suffocating, radiating from the empty bottles scattered across my clean kitchen counters. I did not touch a single one of them. I did not clean up the mess. They were no longer just trash. They were physical exhibits in a federal extortion and conspiracy case. I turned slowly toward the digital wall clock hanging just above the refrigerator. Behind the dark tinted glass of the clock face, a microscopic lens was capturing the entire scene. I walked over to my laptop and pulled up the security feed. I rewound the high-definition video by exactly 15 minutes and pressed play. There was Jason clear as day dumping the empty liquor bottles onto my counter. There was his voice, crisp and absolutely undeniable, explicitly outlining his plan to fabricate evidence, bribe witnesses, and extort me into signing a false confession. The audio quality was absolutely pristine. I closed the laptop, a cold, hard smile spreading across my face. Jason thought he was planting the final nail in my coffin. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed the United States Attorney the smoking gun required to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the next decade. My encrypted phone vibrated against the desk. I answered the secure line. Paul Henderson was on the other end, his voice strictly business. "We have the metadata on the vehicle registration," Paul stated. "The signatures are completely forged, and the notary stamp belongs to a man who has been on Thomas' payroll for over a decade. We are building the warrants now. Have they contacted you about the surrender tonight?" "They just sent their attack dog to intimidate me," I replied. "Jason planted fake evidence to make me look like an alcoholic." Before I could elaborate, my regular cell phone began to ring. I glanced at the caller ID. It was my mother. I told Paul to hold and answered the regular line, instantly dropping my voice back into the soft, anxious tone of the defeated daughter. "Whitney," my mother said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "There has been a slight change of plans for tonight. You are not coming to the estate at 8. I gripped the edge of the counter, injecting a tremor of panic into my response. "What do you mean? Jason just told me I had to be there. Are you calling the police now?" No, nothing like that," Susan soothed. "Chelsea has her most important campaign fundraising gala tonight at the Oak Ridge Country Club. All of our major donors will be there. Your father and I decided it would look strange if you were absent, especially since we want to project a united family front before tomorrow. We want you to come to the gala. We can have one last family dinner, and then we will head over to the precinct together to handle your little situation. It will be much better this way. I closed my eyes, marveling at the pure sociopathy required to host a lavish political fundraiser just 24 hours after leaving a man bleeding on the asphalt. They did not just want my freedom. They wanted to parade me around to score political points before throwing me in a cage. Okay, I whispered softly into the phone. What time should I be there? Arrive at 7, she commanded. And Whitney, please try to look presentable. Wear that dark blue dress we bought you 5 years ago. Do not embarrass us tonight. She hung up without waiting for a reply. I switched back to the encrypted phone, updating Paul on the sudden change of venue. Paul immediately recognized the tactical advantage. A busy, loud fundraising gala meant a chaotic environment where my family would feel untouchable and safe among their wealthy peers. It was the perfect place to gather auditory evidence. Within 2 hours, a female federal agent arrived at my apartment posing as a delivery driver. In the privacy of my bathroom, she carefully taped a state-of-the-art recording device to my ribcage, threading a microscopic microphone up through the collar of my clothing. I went to prepare for my role. I owned several expensive designer suits purchased with my judicial salary, but I completely ignored them. Instead, I reached into the back of the closet and pulled out the dark blue dress my mother had mentioned. It was 5 years old, slightly faded, and lacked any semblance of sophisticated tailoring. I brushed my hair flat, applied zero makeup, and slid my feet into a pair of worn flats. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a powerful federal judge. I saw exactly what my family needed to see. A tired, broken, beaten-down failure who had absolutely nothing left to offer. I drove my unassuming sedan to the Oak Ridge Country Club, pulling up the long driveway lined with towering oak trees, illuminated by warm golden spotlights. Valets in crisp white shirts were busy rushing back and forth, opening the doors of sleek black luxury vehicles and expensive sports cars. I bypassed the valet stand, entirely steering my old car toward the very back of the self-parking lot. I wanted my arrival to go completely unnoticed by the glittering crowd. The rain from yesterday had cleared, leaving a freezing chill in the evening air as I walked across the damp asphalt toward the grand entrance. I stepped through the heavy glass doors into the main ballroom, immediately engulfed by the overwhelming sound of clinking crystal glasses and loud, wealthy laughter. The room was dripping in excessive opulence. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant glow over tables draped in heavy white silk and adorned with towering floral arrangements. Waiters in immaculate black tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. I stood near the entrance, pulling my faded blue dress tighter around my shoulders, looking entirely out of place among the sea of custom-tailored suits and designer evening gowns. I scanned the room and quickly spotted Chelsea. She was standing near the center of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water and throwing her head back in a bright, captivating laugh. She looked absolutely stunning, in a sharp-tailored white pantsuit that projected pure political power and flawless innocence. Watching her smile and charm the wealthy donors, a cold wave of disgust washed over me. She had nearly killed a hard-working single father 24 hours ago, and she was currently glowing with vibrant, completely untroubled energy. She felt absolutely zero remorse. Whitney! The sharp, demanding voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. I turned to see my mother marching toward me. Susan was wearing a heavy emerald green gown and a diamond necklace that caught the chandelier light. She looked me up and down, her lips thinning into a tight line of severe disapproval as she took in my unkempt hair and faded dress. "You look terrible," Susan muttered, grabbing my arm with a painful vice-like grip. "But I suppose that works to our advantage tonight. Come with me. We have people to speak with." She did not hide me in a dark corner. She did not steer me toward the back of the room, away from the important guests. Instead, she dragged me directly toward a tight circle of older, incredibly wealthy individuals standing near the open bar. These were the elite power brokers of the city, the people whose money dictated local elections. Senator Davis, Margaret Susan called out brightly, her face instantly transforming into a mask of radiant, warm delight. I am so glad you both could make it tonight to support Chelsea. The older couple turned around smiling warmly at my mother. Susan pulled me forward, forcing me to stand squarely in the spotlight. I kept my head bowed, playing the role of the intimidated, socially awkward outcast. I wanted to introduce you to my other daughter, Whitney. Susan said, her voice laced with a heavy, deeply patronizing tone of tragic sympathy. She has been going through a very dark, very difficult time lately. We are just so incredibly thankful she could drag herself out of her apartment to be here tonight. The older woman named Margaret looked at me with immediate uncomfortable pity. Oh, I am so sorry to hear that, dear. It is always hard to find your footing in this world. Susan sighed dramatically, placing a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. It is a daily struggle for her. She has been battling some very serious personal demons for years now. We have tried to get her the help she needs, but some people just refuse to be saved. We are just praying she does not do anything reckless to hurt herself or someone else. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The invitation to this gala was not about family unity. It was a calculated, brilliant piece of stagecraft. Susan was actively publicly establishing my mental instability to the most influential people in the city. She was planting the exact seeds needed to make my impending confession believable. When the news broke tomorrow that I had drunkenly run down a pedestrian, Senator Davis and his wife would remember this exact conversation. They would remember the tragic, unkempt daughter battling personal demons, and they would feel nothing but deep, profound sympathy for poor Susan and her flawless political candidate daughter. I kept my eyes glued to the expensive carpet, forcing my shoulders to shake slightly, as if I were holding back tears of deep personal shame. I nodded weakly at the wealthy donors playing the broken scapegoat to absolute perfection. I am just taking it one day at a time, I whispered, making sure the microphone hidden against my ribs captured every single word of my mother's brilliant sociopathic performance. Susan patted my shoulder again, a proud, sickeningly sweet smile on her face. That is all we can ask for, sweetheart. She was setting the stage for my total destruction, completely unaware that I was gathering the exact evidence needed to burn her entire world straight to the ground. She turned back to the senator, launching into a conversation about the catering, fully convinced her devious plan was working perfectly, and my tragic fate was already securely sealed today. I slipped away from her suffocating grip and drifted toward the edges of the ballroom, playing the part of the wallflower. My eyes scanned the crowd, quickly locating my sister. Chelsea was standing near the center of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water and throwing her head back in a bright, captivating laugh. She looked stunning in a sharp-tailored white pantsuit, projecting pure political power. She was glowing with vibrant, completely untroubled energy, showing absolutely zero remorse for the man currently fighting for his life in a hospital bed because of her actions. As I moved closer to the open bar, Chelsea spotted me. Her bright smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, undisguised contempt. She excused herself from a group of wealthy donors and marched directly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She did not stop until she was standing inches from my face, invading my personal space to ensure no one else could hear her words. "You look absolutely pathetic," Chelsea whispered, her voice a low, vicious hiss. "I cannot believe Jason actually let you leave the house looking like a homeless person. But I guess it fits the narrative perfectly." I shrank back slightly, clutching my arms around my waist. "I did what Jason told me to do," I stammered, making sure the wire picked up my manufactured anxiety. "He said you needed me here to show family unity before I go to the police station tomorrow." Chelsea let out a short, cruel laugh, glancing around to make sure the donors were still watching her with admiration. "Family unity," she scoffed. "You are not family, Whitney. You are an inconvenience. You are a speed bump that I am paying to have removed from my campaign trail. Do you honestly think anyone in this room cares about a miserable dropout who could not even handle a low-level desk job?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. "You are going to sign that confession tomorrow, and you are going to take the plea deal Jason arranged. Because if you do not, I will personally make sure the local police leak those photos of your apartment to the press." Everyone in this state will see exactly what a disgusting, hopeless drunk you really are. I told you I would do it. I whimpered, staring at her expensive white shoes. I just wanted to make sure Jason was telling the truth about the police chief. Are you sure he will not just arrest me and throw me in jail for years? Chelsea rolled her eyes, completely oblivious to the fact that she was actively confirming a massive federal conspiracy directly into a recording device. Oh, please, she sneered. Dad has Chief Miller completely in his pocket. He has been funding Miller's re-election campaigns for a decade. Jason already met with him this morning and handed over a very generous cash donation from my campaign fund. Miller knows exactly how to handle your booking, so the press only gets the story we want them to get. You will do your little stint on probation, and my campaign will not even face a minor hiccup. The sheer volume of federal crimes she had just casually admitted to was staggering. Bribery of a public official, campaign finance violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice. She was handing me the nails for her own coffin, and she was doing it with a smug, victorious smile. Now go stand in the corner and try not to look so completely miserable, Chelsea ordered, turning her back on me and instantly pasting her bright, captivating smile back onto her face as she walked toward a group of wealthy real estate developers. I stayed near the bar, watching the grotesque theater of my family unfold. My father Thomas was holding court near the massive arched windows, puffing his chest out as he spoke with a group of local judges and city councilmen. I moved slowly in his direction, keeping my head down and nursing a glass of club soda, ensuring I was close enough for the wire to capture his booming voice. It is all about controlling the narrative, gentlemen. Thomas laughed, swirling a glass of expensive scotch. In real estate and in politics, you have to control the narrative before the narrative controls you. You have to know how to eliminate your liabilities. I took a slow sip of my club soda, the cold, hard reality of his words settling into my bones. He was not talking about bad investments or zoning laws. I was talking about me. I was the liability. He was eliminating trading my freedom to secure his golden child's political future. They had built this entire gala to celebrate their untouchable power, completely unaware that I was standing right in the middle of their grand illusion, quietly dismantling it piece by piece. The evidence I had gathered tonight was devastating, and I was ready to bring their entire empire crashing down. I took another sip of my club soda, letting the icy liquid ground me in the present moment. The ballroom felt suffocatingly warm, the heavy scent of expensive floral arrangements mixing with the overwhelming aroma of roasted meats and fine perfumes. I needed to isolate Jason next. Getting Chelsea to casually confess to federal crimes in the middle of a crowded room had been almost too easy a testament to her towering arrogance. But Jason was a different kind of animal. How was a political operative trained to navigate scandals and protect liabilities? I had to approach him carefully, playing the exact notes of panic and submission he expected from a defeated scapegoat. I spotted him standing near the heavy mahogany doors that led to the outdoor smoking terrace. He was checking his phone, his brow furrowed in concentration. I set my glass down on a passing waiter's tray and moved toward him, wrapping my arms tightly around my waist. I made sure my steps were small and hesitant, practically shrinking into myself as I approached. Jason, I whispered, keeping my voice trembling. He snapped his phone shut and looked down at me, his expression immediately hardening into a look of severe annoyance. What do you want, Whitney? I told you to stay out of sight and let your mother handle the introductions. I am sorry, I stammered, looking nervously at the polished brass door handle. I just cannot stop thinking about my apartment, about all those empty bottles you left everywhere. Jason rolled his eyes and grabbed my elbow, pulling me firmly out onto the dimly lit terrace. The cold night air hit my face, but I focused entirely on the small microphone taped to my ribs. We were completely alone, the heavy doors muffling the music from the ballroom. Are you really losing your nerve right now? Jason asked, his voice a harsh, demanding hiss. We went over this today. You do not need to worry about the apartment. But what if the police think I am a terrible person? I pleaded, leaning into the manufactured anxiety. You brought so many bottles, Jason. Cheap vodka whiskey. What if they look at all that and decide to give me a maximum sentence? They are going to think I am a complete alcoholic. Jason let out a sharp, dismissive sigh, leaning against the stone railing. That is the entire point, Whitney. I spent $200 at a discount liquor store this morning to make sure that kitchen looked like a legitimate disaster zone. I intentionally picked the cheapest, most pathetic brands I could find because it fits the profile of a disgraced unemployed burnout trying to drink away the guilt of running down a pedestrian. It gives the police a perfect, neatly packaged motive. They see the bottles, they see the depression, and they close the case without asking any difficult questions about Chelsea. But why did you have to dump them in the sink? I whined softly, pushing him for more specific audio confirmation. Because staging a believable crime scene requires attention to detail. He snapped, clearly exasperated by my apparent stupidity. A struggling alcoholic does not neatly recycle her garbage. She throws it wherever it lands. It is called building a comprehensive narrative. Just like the cash I handed to Chief Miller this morning. I gave him $25,000 from the campaign discretionary fund to ensure his booking officers do not look too closely at the timeline. Between the staged apartment, the bribe, and the fact that the SUV is legally registered in your name, you are completely boxed in. So stop crying and just play your part. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper and nodded. Okay, I understand. I will go back inside. He turned away in disgust, pulling a cigar from his pocket. I walked back into the warmth of the ballroom, a surge of pure judicial satisfaction coursing through my veins. Jason had just handed the federal prosecutors a beautifully wrapped gift. I had the campaign manager explicitly detailing the staging of evidence, the exact amount of the bribe, and the source of the illicit funds. Now I only needed the architect of this entire nightmare, my father. I scanned the room, Thomas excusing himself from a group of local judges, heading toward the quiet wood-paneled corridor that led to the private executive suites. I followed him, maintaining my meek posture until we were isolated in the silent, carpeted hallway. Dad, I called out softly. He stopped and turned around, his jaw tightening the moment he saw me. What is it now, Whitney? I am in the middle of securing crucial endorsements for your sister. I just need a minute, I said, twisting my hands together. I am just so scared about tomorrow. When I go to the police station, what if they figure out the truth? What if they find out about the registration? Thomas took a heavy step toward me, towering over my slumped frame. His eyes were cold and devoid of any paternal warmth. We have been over this. They are not going to figure anything out because there is nothing to figure out. On paper, you are the sole owner of that vehicle. But I never signed those papers, I pushed, keeping my voice fragile and pleading. I was not even living in the state when Chelsea bought that SUV. If they run a handwriting analysis, they are going to know I did not sign that title. Thomas let out a low, menacing chuckle. Do you honestly think the local police are going to run a forensic handwriting analysis on a routine traffic confession? You are giving them far too much credit. I forged your signature on those documents 3 years ago because Chelsea could not get insured after her second drunk driving incident. I had my own notary stamp the paperwork. The state accepted it without a single question. It is a legally binding document as far as the police are concerned. You own the car, therefore you bear the responsibility for what happens in it. But she hit a man, I cried softly, making sure the horror in my voice sounded entirely authentic. Dad, she left him bleeding on the highway. How can you ask me to go to prison for something so violent? How can you protect her after what she did? My father leaned down, his face mere inches from mine. Because she is worth protecting, Whitney. Chelsea is going to be a state senator. She is going to wield real power, make vital connections, and elevate this entire family. That man on the highway was just some nobody walking in the rain. An unfortunate accident. I am not going to let a minor tragedy destroy a multi-million-dollar political investment. You are going to go to the precinct tomorrow. You are going to take the blame for hitting that pedestrian, and you are going to consider it your final contribution to the family you walked away from. If you mention one word about me forging your signature or Chelsea driving that vehicle, I will personally see to it that you are destroyed. Do we understand each other? Yes, Dad, I whispered, bowing my head. I understand perfectly. I will follow your instructions when I surrender to the police tomorrow. I will stay quiet about what Chelsea really did to that poor man on the dark highway last night. My father stared at me for a long moment, completely satisfied with his ruthless subjugation of my spirit. He adjusted the expensive silk tie at his collar, gave me one final look of utter disdain, and walked back into the glittering ballroom to rejoin the elite. I stood alone in the quiet corridor, my back pressed against the cool wood paneling. The microphone taped to my ribs felt warm against my skin, heavily laden with the audio gold I had just extracted. I had Jason detailing the bribe to the police chief. I had Thomas confessing to federal fraud and witness tampering. I had enough evidence to destroy them. But my legal mind kept snagging on one glaring inconsistency. Chelsea was not a reckless driver. She was selfish and cruel, but she was also incredibly image-conscious. She never drove herself after drinking at public events. So why was she speeding down the dark coastal highway alone in the middle of a torrential rainstorm last night? What was so urgent that she had to drive herself? I pushed myself off the wall and walked slowly back toward the main event space. I did not want to leave until I had the complete picture. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, keeping my head down and avoiding eye contact. I checked the bar, the dining area, and the terrace, but neither Chelsea nor Jason were anywhere to be found. I wandered toward the back of the building where the club maintained several private VIP meeting rooms. As I approached the hallway, leading to the executive suites, I heard the faint, sharp sound of my sister speaking. I stopped, pressing myself into the deep shadow of a large decorative marble column. Through the crack of a partially opened mahogany door, just a few feet away, I could see Jason pacing furiously. Chelsea was sitting on the edge of a leather sofa, her arms crossed tightly over her white pantsuit. Sitting across from her was an older man I instantly recognized. It was Harrison Cole, the chief executive officer of Apex Industries, a massive corporate conglomerate currently under federal investigation for environmental violations. Harrison sat with a heavy crystal glass of bourbon resting on his knee. He looked absolutely furious. I held my breath, leaning closer to the crack in the door, making absolutely sure the hidden microphone was positioned perfectly to capture their voices. "You are acting completely out of line." "Harrison." Chelsea hissed, her tone devoid of the sweet charm she had been projecting all evening. "I told you the situation is entirely under control. The police are not looking for me." "Under control." Harrison fired back, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You nearly destroyed everything last night, Chelsea. When you left my private office, you were highly intoxicated and driving erratically. If the local authorities had pulled you over with that briefcase in your back seat, my entire corporation would be facing federal indictments this morning." Jason stopped pacing and pointed a sharp finger at the corporate executive. "Keep your voice down, Harrison. Nobody is getting indicted. We secured the briefcase the moment Chelsea got back to the estate. The money is completely safe." "The money?" Harrison scoffed loudly, standing up from his chair. "It is $250,000 in untraceable cash. That was not a simple campaign donation. That was a direct transaction for your guarantee that the new coastal zoning regulations will be permanently buried. If anyone finds out I handed $250,000 to a state senate candidate, we are all going to federal prison. And then you go and hit a pedestrian 5 miles down the road." My heart slammed against my rib cage, the sheer magnitude of their crime washing over me. This was the missing piece. Chelsea had not just been driving home from a late party. She had been speeding away from a secret, highly illegal meeting with a corrupt corporate executive. She had a briefcase containing $250,000 in bribe money sitting in her back seat when she struck David. She did not drive away simply because she was scared of a scandal. She drove away because stopping for the police would have exposed a massive federal bribery scheme. "Do not lecture me," Harrison Chelsea snapped, standing up from the leather sofa to face him. "I got the money home safely, did I not? I secured our arrangement. And as for the accident, my pathetic sister is taking the fall for the hit and run tomorrow morning. She is already terrified and entirely compliant. The police have the car registered in her name, and they have been generously compensated to look the other way. You will get your zoning laws destroyed and I will get my Senate seat. So stop panicking and go back out there to smile for the cameras." I stood frozen behind the marble column, my mind sorting what I had just heard. This was no longer only a state hit-and-run cover-up. The cash payment, the campaign arrangement, and Harrison Cole's interstate corporation created serious federal exposure for bribery, fraud, and campaign finance offenses. But that did not make it my case to judge. Because I was a victim, a witness, and Chelsea's sister, I would be walled off from any judicial decision. The significance was simpler. Independent federal prosecutors now had jurisdiction to act. Harrison stood up, buttoning his expensive suit jacket with sharp, angry movements. You better be right about your sister Chelsea. Because if she breaks and the authorities start digging into your movements last night, I will not go down alone. I will hand the federal prosecutors everything they need to bury you and your father. She will not break, Jason said confidently, stepping forward to open the door wider. She is a weak, broke nobody who is terrified of her own shadow. She does not have the resources or the intelligence to fight us. Now please go back to the ballroom before people start asking questions about you. I quickly backed away from the column, my soft shoes making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. I retreated into the main ballroom, blending seamlessly into a group of people crowding around the dessert table as Harrison Cole emerged from the hallway, followed by Chelsea and Jason. I kept my eyes cast downward, playing the role of the invisible tragic outcast. I had everything I needed. The audio recording was no longer just evidence of a local cover-up. It was a massive federal indictment waiting to be unsealed. My family thought they had backed a helpless victim into a corner. They had absolutely no idea. They had just handed a sitting federal judge the exact weapons required to obliterate their political ambitions, dismantle my father, and send every single one of them to a federal penitentiary. I walked toward the exit of the country club. My mother caught my eye from across the room, giving me a stern, commanding nod, expecting my total surrender tomorrow. I did not nod back. I walked out the heavy glass doors into the freezing night air. Tomorrow they would drag me into the local police precinct, expecting a quiet confession. They would expect me to sign away my freedom to protect their secrets. But they were walking into a federal trap of their own making, and I was going to ensure the jaws snapped shut with devastating precision. The next morning broke with a pale gray light filtering through the modest blinds of my apartment. I had not slept. Instead, I had spent the early hours of the morning securely transmitting the encrypted audio files from the gala directly to Paul Henderson at the United States Attorney's Office. The federal warrants were signed, sealed, and ready to be executed. All I had to do now was play my part in the final act of this grotesque play. I took a hot shower, letting the water wash away the lingering scent of the country club. I dressed in dark slacks and a plain blouse. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat at my small kitchen island, staring at the pile of empty liquor bottles Jason had left in the sink. I did not have to wait long. At precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy silence of my building was shattered by the sound of tires screeching onto the pavement outside. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the blinds back just a fraction of an inch. 3 black and white local police cruisers were parked haphazardly, blocking the narrow street in front of my apartment building. Their red and blue lights were flashing brightly, casting a harsh, frantic glow against the brick walls. 2 large, uniformed officers stepped out of the lead cruiser. They did not look like men arriving to conduct a standard traffic inquiry. They walked with aggressive, heavy steps, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. A few moments later, a loud, violent pounding echoed down the hallway outside my door. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of a fist hammering against the wood with the clear intention of causing intimidation. Police department opened defeat. I walked over to the door and unlocked the deadbolt, pulling it open with a trembling hand. The 2 officers pushed their way inside before I could even say a word. The taller of the 2, a man with a thick neck and a name tag that read Officer Jenkins, glared down at me. Whitney Wilson, he barked, his tone completely devoid of standard professional courtesy. You are under arrest for leaving the scene of a severe bodily injury collision. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. He did not ask if I owned the vehicle or discuss the events. He grabbed my shoulder and spun me around, shoving my chest against the wall. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, biting into my skin. Please, I whispered, projecting a perfectly terrified tremor into my voice. I do not understand what is happening. Save it for the judge, Lady, Jenkins sneered, yanking my arms up slightly to cause a sharp ache in my shoulders. We have your vehicle in custody. We have the registration proving you own it. And looking around this place, it is pretty obvious you have some serious issues. He gestured his chin toward the kitchen, where the scattered liquor bottles sat in plain view. The second officer walked over to the counter, pulling a small digital camera from his pocket. He began snapping photos of the bottles, documenting the exact false narrative Jason had so meticulously staged the day before. They were not conducting a real investigation. They were simply checking off the boxes Thomas had paid them to complete. "You have the right to remain silent." Jenkins droned out rapidly, slurring the Miranda warning together as if it were a minor annoyance. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." He grabbed my arm and dragged me out of my apartment. He marched me down the narrow hallway toward the elevator. My neighbors were peeking out, watching in shock as I was hauled away. I kept my head bowed, letting my hair fall forward to hide my face, playing the role of the utterly humiliated suspect. When the elevator doors slid open on the ground floor, the chaotic scene in the lobby hit me like a physical blow. My parents and Chelsea stood in the middle of the entrance. Next to my father stood a tall, slickly dressed man holding a leather briefcase. My family had timed their arrival perfectly. They wanted maximum visibility to ensure the neighborhood witnessed their supposedly unwavering parental support for a troubled criminal daughter. "Whitney," my mother shrieked, throwing her hands up to her mouth in a flawless display of theatrical horror. "Oh, my poor baby, what are they doing to you?" Susan rushed forward, pushing past Officer Jenkins, and threw her arms around my handcuffed body. To the neighbors watching from the stairwell, she looked like a heartbroken mother, desperately trying to comfort her child. But as she squeezed me, her voice dropped into a harsh, venomous whisper right against my ear. "Do not say a single word until we get to the precinct. You keep your mouth shut and just cry." She pulled back, tears streaming down her perfectly powdered cheeks. Thomas placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, looking at the officers. "Officers, I am Thomas Wilson. This is my daughter. We have retained counsel for her. This is Arthur, pending the legal proceedings. We demand that she be treated with dignity." The lawyer Arthur gave a crisp, professional nod. "My client will not be answering any questions at the scene. We will follow you directly to the precinct to handle the booking process and arrange for immediate bail." Jenkins, who had likely been briefed on exactly who was paying for this entire spectacle, immediately softened his aggressive posture. "Understood, Mr. Wilson. We will transport her to the downtown station now." Chelsea stood slightly behind our father, wearing a modest beige trench coat and a look of deep sympathetic concern. She reached out and gently touched my arm, her eyes wide and mournful for the benefit of the onlookers. "We are here for you, Whitney," she said softly. "We are not going to abandon you. We will get you the help you so desperately need." I looked at my sister, allowing a fresh wave of manufactured tears to well up in my eyes. The sheer absolute evil of her performance was staggering. She was using my orchestrated arrest as a photo opportunity to practice her empathetic political persona. I gave her a weak, pathetic nod, keeping my head tucked low as the officers finally led me out the glass doors of the lobby and out into the cold morning air. The street was lined with curious onlookers. People were stopping on the sidewalks, pointing and whispering as the police guided me toward the back of the cruiser. My father walked closely on my right side, while the lawyer flanked my left, creating a protective wall that was actually a mobile prison. Before I stepped down into the back seat of the police car, Arthur leaned in close, his expensive cologne masking the smell of the damp pavement. "Listen to me very carefully," Whitney, the lawyer, murmured, his tone smooth, but laced with undeniable menace. "When we get to the interrogation room, you are going to sign a typed statement acknowledging your guilt. I have already negotiated a plea arrangement with the district attorney, who owes your father a considerable favor. You will receive 2 years of probation and mandatory alcohol counseling. If you deviate from the script for even 1 second, if you try to blame anyone else, they will throw the book at you, and I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years in a state penitentiary." I looked up at him, widening my eyes in pure fabricated terror. "I will sign it," I whimpered. "Just please do not let them lock me up." Arthur smiled a cold, satisfied smirk and patted my shoulder. "Good girl, just follow my lead." Officer Jenkins pushed his heavy hand down on the top of my head, forcing me into the hard plastic back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut behind me, locking with a heavy mechanical clunk. I sat in the confined space, staring through the metal mesh divider as the officers climbed into the front seats. Outside, my family was climbing into my father's luxury sedan, their faces immediately dropping the facade of concern the second they were behind tinted glass. They thought they had won. They thought they were driving me to a precinct they entirely controlled to sign my life away. As the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, the sirens blaring to clear the morning traffic, I leaned my head back against the hard plastic seat. I stopped crying. My breathing steadied. The final pieces were moving into place. They were rushing eagerly toward the interrogation room, completely unaware that they were marching directly into a federal slaughterhouse. The ride to the downtown precinct was short, but the silence inside the police cruiser felt suffocating. We pulled into the secured underground garage of the station, the heavy metal gate rolling down behind us with a loud crash. Officer Jenkins hauled me out of the back seat by my upper arm. He did not bother walking me through the main booking area, where other officers or civilian clerks might see me. Instead, he guided me through a series of dimly lit concrete corridors that bypassed the standard intake procedures entirely. The corruption of this precinct was built right into its architecture, designed to accommodate the discrete needs of the wealthy men who funded it. We reached a heavy steel door at the end of a long hallway. Jenkins pushed it open and shoved me inside. The interrogation room was exactly as stark as I had anticipated. The walls were painted a dull institutional gray that seemed to absorb all the light from the single fluorescent bulb buzzing overhead. In the center of the room sat a scratched metal table bolted firmly to the linoleum floor, with two rigid metal chairs on either side. Jenkins forced me into the chair facing the door. He unclipped my handcuffs only to immediately reattach my right wrist to a heavy metal ring secured to the surface of the table. He did not say a word to me. He simply turned around, walked out, and let the heavy steel door shut. The lock engaged with a loud click, leaving me alone. I sat there for several long minutes, the cold metal of the table seeping into my skin. I did not rub my wrist or massage my shoulder. I maintained my hunched, terrified posture, knowing full well that a camera was mounted behind the dark mirror on the opposite wall. The precinct was dirty, but my federal wire was pristine, and it was currently transmitting every sound in this room directly to Paul Henderson and a team of federal agents parked in a surveillance van 3 blocks away. The heavy latch on the door suddenly clacked loudly. The door swung open, but it was not a detective who walked through. It was my father Thomas, followed closely by my sister Chelsea and the defense attorney Arthur. That the local police chief had allowed civilian family members and a private lawyer into a secure interrogation room before any official questioning began was a massive procedural violation. It was the ultimate proof of my father's absolute control over this building. Arthur closed the door behind them, engaging the deadbolt from the inside to ensure privacy. The moment the lock clicked, the carefully constructed facade of the worried, loving family evaporated completely. There were no more tears on Chelsea's face. There was no tragic paternal concern in my father's eyes. The masks hit the floor, and the raw, ugly truth of their characters filled the small space. Thomas walked slowly around the metal table, pulling out the chair opposite me. He sat down heavily, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, as if he were settling in for a routine boardroom negotiation. He looked at me, his eyes flat and devoid of empathy. "You played your part adequately outside," my father said. "The neighbors saw exactly what they needed to see. Now it is time to conclude this unfortunate business, so we can all move on with our lives." Chelsea did not sit down. She paced slowly around the perimeter of the small room, her high heels clicking against the linoleum. She traced her manicured fingers along the edge of the metal table, circling around behind my chair. She was reveling in this moment, absolutely intoxicated by the sheer power she held over my life. She had destroyed a man's body on the highway, and now she was about to destroy her sister's future, and she felt nothing but satisfaction. "You actually had me worried for a second yesterday," Whitney Chelsea said, stopping right behind my chair and leaning down so her voice was right near my ear. "When you tried to walk out the front door, I thought you might actually be stupid enough to try and fight us. But seeing you sitting here chained to a table right where you belong, I am glad you tried to resist. It makes seeing you finally surrender so much more satisfying. I kept my eyes glued to the scratched surface of the metal table, letting my shoulders shake slightly. "Why are you doing this to me?" I whispered, making sure the hidden microphone picked up the raw manufactured desperation in my voice. "I am your sister, Chelsea. How can you just stand there and watch me take the blame for someone you hit?" Chelsea let out a loud, sharp laugh. She walked around to the front of the table, leaning over so she was directly in my line of sight. She slammed her hands down onto the cold metal right next to where my wrist was bound. "Do you still not understand how the real world works?" she hissed, her face twisting into a mask of pure arrogant malice. "This is not about family, Whitney. This is about value. I have value. I have a campaign. I have donors. I have a future that is going to dictate the laws of this entire state. You have absolutely nothing. You are a ghost living in a pathetic little apartment working a miserable government desk job that nobody respects." She pushed herself off the table and crossed her arms over her chest, looking down at me with ultimate disgust. "You can cry and whine about fairness all you want, but the truth is right in front of you. Even if you somehow manage to get out of this chair and run to a judge with your little story, who is a jury going to believe? The future state senator or the ugly dropout who could not even make it in corporate law?" The insult hung in the cold, sterile air of the interrogation room. It was the absolute distillation of everything my family believed about me. They believed my physical appearance, my career choices, and my rejection of their toxic wealth made me a subhuman entity, completely devoid of rights or dignity. They believed their social standing was an impenetrable shield that gave them the absolute right to destroy me for their own convenience. I looked up at her, letting a single tear slip down my cheek for the final time. I did not say anything because there was nothing left to say. She had just verbally confirmed her motive, her lack of remorse and her total reliance on her political status to evade justice right into a federal wire. Arthur, the defense attorney, stepped forward, clearing his throat to break the heavy silence. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy white paper. He placed it squarely in the center of the metal table right in front of me. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out an expensive silver fountain pen, and laid it carefully next to the document. "This is the sworn statement," Arthur said, his tone smooth and deeply patronizing. "It outlines exactly what we discussed. It states that you borrowed your sister's vehicle without her immediate knowledge, that you were driving under the influence of alcohol, and that you panicked after striking a pedestrian in the heavy rain. It also clearly waives your right to a trial in exchange for the negotiated plea deal." Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and steepled his fingers together. "Read it quickly, Whitney. Chief Miller is waiting in his office down the hall. The moment you sign that paper, Arthur will take it directly to the booking sergeant. They will process your fingerprints, take your mugshot, and release you on personal recognizance within the hour. You go back to your apartment, you keep your head down, and you let Arthur handle the rest of the legal circus." I stared at the confession. The black ink looked stark against the bright white paper. It was a meticulously crafted lie designed to permanently chain me to a felony conviction while elevating my sister to a position of immense political power. It was the final trap. "Sign the paper," Whitney, Chelsea commanded, tapping her foot impatiently against the floor. "I have a campaign luncheon at noon, and you have already wasted enough of my time today. Do exactly what you are told so we can all get out of this disgusting building." I looked at the silver pen resting on the table. My hand was shaking, but not from fear. The adrenaline surging through my veins was electric. The performance was over. The evidence was secured. The federal trap was primed and loaded, and all I had to do now was pull the trigger. Slowly, I lifted my left hand and placed my fingertips against the edge of the thick white paper. I pushed it across the table. It made a soft scraping sound as it slid away from me, coming to a halt directly in front of Arthur. I sat back, dropping my hunched, defensive posture. I straightened my spine and lifted my chin to look directly into my father's eyes. The manufactured tears instantly dried up. The trembling in my hands vanished. The terrified, broken daughter they thought they had dragged into this room ceased to exist. Thomas frowned, genuine confusion crossing his face as he registered the dramatic shift in my body language. He glanced at the paper, then back at me. Arthur was the first to break the tense silence. He leaned forward, tapping his manicured finger against the edge of the table. You do not understand your position. Whitney, the defense attorney, said, his voice dropping to a hard, threatening register. This is not a negotiation. You sign the confession right now, or I walk out that steel door, and you face the criminal justice system completely alone. I am not signing anything. I stated, my voice devoid of the pathetic tone I had used for the past 24 hours. I am not taking a plea deal. I am not accepting probation. And I am absolutely not taking the blame for a violent crime my sister committed while driving away from an illegal meeting with a corporate executive. Chelsea gasped, taking a sudden step backward until her trench coat hit the concrete wall. Her victorious smirk completely vanished, replaced by sheer shock. Arthur blinked, his professional composure cracking for a fraction of a second. Thomas slammed his hand down on the metal table, the crack echoing violently off the bare gray walls. Have you completely lost your mind? My father roared, his face flushing a dark, dangerous red. He stood up from his chair, towering over the table. You are sitting in a police precinct in handcuffs. We have the physical evidence perfectly staged in your apartment. We have the vehicle registration linking you to the crime. You have absolutely no leverage here. You sign that piece of paper this exact second, or I swear to God I will end you. I did not flinch. I did not cower. I looked up at him with a cold, detached expression. You are not going to do anything, Thomas, I replied, dropping the title of father entirely. You are going to stand there and realize that your money and your arrogance have finally blinded you to reality. You cannot buy your way out of this. Chelsea hit a man on the coastal highway. She left him bleeding on the wet pavement. And no amount of staged liquor bottles or forged registration documents is going to change the fact that she is the one going to prison. Chelsea let out a frantic, high-pitched sound of panic. Dad, she whined, her voice trembling with sudden, genuine fear. What is she talking about? How does she know where I was last night? Make her sign it. Make her sign it right now. You are bluffing, Arthur interjected, trying to regain control of the room. You have no proof of anything. You are just a desperate woman trying to deflect blame. The police have the car, and they have your signature on the title. My signature was forged 3 years ago. I countered smoothly, shifting my gaze to the lawyer. And any competent forensic document examiner will prove it in a matter of hours. Just like they will easily prove that the empty liquor bottles in my kitchen were purchased by Jason this morning. You see, Arthur, when you suborn perjury and conspire to obstruct justice, you really should make sure the scapegoat you are trying to frame does not have a state-of-the-art hidden security system recording every single threat. Arthur froze, the color draining slightly from his face. He looked at Thomas, a sudden shadow of doubt crossing his professional demeanor. Thomas ignored him, his eyes locked onto mine with a look of pure, murderous rage. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. Fine. Thomas spat out his thumb, jabbing aggressively at the screen. You want to play games? We will play games. I gave you the easy way out. I offered to pay your rent and keep you out of a cell. Now I am calling Chief Miller. I am going to have Officer Jenkins walk back in here, formally book you for felony hit and run, and leak those photos of your apartment directly to the local news stations before noon. You are going to be a public disgrace by the time you eat lunch. He held the phone up to his ear, his jaw clenched tight as he waited for the call to connect. Arthur stood by the table, looking deeply uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene as his wealthy client executed the backup plan. Chelsea was breathing heavily, clutching the lapels of her coat, watching our father with desperate, expectant eyes. I sat perfectly still, my right wrist still chained to the heavy metal ring on the table, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound peace. I watched Thomas wait for the line to pick up. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room stretched out for 10 seconds, then 20. Thomas frowned, pulling the phone away from his ear to look at the screen. He tapped the glass violently, his frustration mounting. Pick up the phone, Miller, he muttered under his breath, lifting the device back to his ear. He waited another 10 seconds, his facial expression shifting from angry impatience to genuine confusion. He lowered the phone again, pressing his thumb against the screen to end the call and dial a different number. I am calling the front desk, he announced to the room, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. Someone needs to get Jenkins in here right now. He waited again. The silence in the small gray room grew thicker, heavier, and infinitely more suffocating. Thomas stared at the blank wall opposite him, listening to the dead air on the other end of the line. The call was not going to voicemail. It was not ringing. It was simply a dead, disconnected void. He slowly lowered the phone, his brow furrowed in deep, unsettling bewilderment. Arthur reached into his own pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He stared at the screen, his professional mask slipping completely. "I do not have any service," the lawyer said, his voice tight with sudden alarm. "It says there is no network connection." "That is impossible. I was just sending an email from the lobby 10 minutes ago." Chelsea stepped away from the wall, her hands shaking as she pulled her own phone from her designer purse. "Mine is dead too," she whispered, her voice rising in panic. "Dad, what is going on? Why is nobody answering the phones?" Thomas shoved his phone back into his jacket pocket, his imposing stature suddenly seeming much less threatening. He looked at me, a tiny flicker of genuine apprehension finally breaking through his arrogant exterior. He turned away from the metal table and marched toward the heavy steel door. "I will handle this myself," he growled, reaching for the deadbolt. "These local idiots cannot manage a simple booking without me holding their hands." He unlocked the deadbolt with a loud click and pulled the heavy door open, stepping halfway out into the concrete corridor. He opened his mouth, fully prepared to shout for Officer Jenkins or Chief Miller. But the words died in his throat. He froze in the doorway, his hand gripping the edge of the steel frame so hard his knuckles turned white. "What is it?" Chelsea asked, rushing forward to peer over his shoulder. Thomas did not answer. He slowly stepped back into the interrogation room, pulling the door open wider. The hallway outside was completely empty. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered slightly, illuminating a long, barren stretch of concrete. There were no booking clerks walking past with paperwork. There were no local patrolmen chatting by the water cooler. The distinct, chaotic noise of a busy downtown police precinct had completely vanished. It was absolutely terrifyingly silent. "Where did everyone go?" Arthur asked, stepping toward the door, his eyes wide with rising dread. The front desk was fully staffed when we walked in. Jenkins and his partner were standing right outside this door 5 minutes ago. They cannot just abandon a suspect in an interrogation room. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The suffocating arrogance, the absolute certainty that they controlled the entire world, evaporated into the cold, sterile air. It was replaced by a sudden creeping paranoia that wrapped around them like a vice. They were standing in the middle of a police station they had bought and paid for, yet they were entirely inexplicably alone. Chelsea looked at me, her chest heaving as pure panic finally set in. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice shrill and terrified. "What is happening outside?" I did not bother to answer her frantic, demanding question. I just sat in my rigid metal chair, my hands resting calmly on the scratched surface of the table, and listened to the profound, beautiful silence of their collapsing empire. I knew the absolute silence meant the heavily armed federal agents had already secured the perimeter, severing all communications and locking down the entire precinct completely. The profound silence of the empty police precinct pressed against the walls of the interrogation room like a physical weight. My father stood frozen in the open doorway, his knuckles white where his hand gripped the heavy steel frame. For a man who had spent his entire life orchestrating every variable in his environment, the total absence of control was visibly paralyzing. He stared down the long, barren concrete corridor, his eyes searching for any sign of the corrupt local officers he had paid to orchestrate this nightmare. There was nothing but the harsh buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. Chelsea took a hesitant step away from the wall, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. The sound seemed entirely too loud in the dead quiet of the room. She looked at our father, her face pale and drawn. She asked him what was happening, her voice cracking with a raw, unfiltered terror that she usually reserved for losing a major political endorsement. She demanded to know where the police chief had gone and why the building felt like a graveyard. Thomas slowly pulled his hand away from the doorframe and took a step backward into the room. He did not answer her. He could not answer her. The absolute certainty that had defined his posture just minutes ago had vanished, replaced by the creeping realization that his money and influence had suddenly lost all currency. He looked at Arthur, seeking the professional reassurance he was paying exorbitant hourly rates to receive. But Arthur was already abandoning a sinking ship. The slick defense attorney was hurriedly shoving his legal pads and his expensive silver fountain pen back into his leather briefcase. His hands were shaking. He muttered that something was terribly wrong, that a precinct did not simply empty out in the middle of a Tuesday morning unless a massive external force had ordered a complete evacuation. He snapped the latches of his briefcase shut and took a step toward the door, clearly intending to leave us behind and save his own professional reputation. Before Arthur could even cross the threshold, a deep, resonant sound echoed through the concrete walls of the building. It was not the casual, sloppy noise of local patrolmen joking by the water cooler. It was a heavy, synchronized thud that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like a perfectly orchestrated military maneuver. My father stepped back again, pushing Chelsea behind him in a rare display of protective instinct. The color drained completely from Arthur's face. He backed away from the open doorway, clutching his briefcase tightly against his chest, as if it could somehow shield him from whatever was coming down that hallway. The sound grew louder, multiplying into the unmistakable rhythm of dozens of heavy tactical boots marching in perfect unison. Then came the sharp, commanding voices. They were not shouting frantically. They were communicating with absolute, terrifying discipline. They called out clear status reports, declaring rooms clear and securing perimeters. The voices echoed down the long hallway, growing closer with every passing second. Chelsea grabbed the sleeve of my father's tailored suit, pulling on the expensive fabric. She was hyperventilating now, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She asked if it was the press, if someone had tipped off the media about her being at the police station. She was still so entirely consumed by her political image that she could not comprehend the magnitude of the danger closing in around her. "It is not the press," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he backed himself into the far corner of the small gray room. "The press does not wear tactical boots." Suddenly, the heavy steel door of our interrogation room was kicked open the rest of the way. It slammed violently against the concrete wall, the loud crash making Chelsea scream and cover her ears. The doorway was immediately filled with the imposing figures of heavily armed federal agents. They moved with a swift, fluid precision that made the corrupt local officers from this morning look like amateurs playing dress-up. Two agents in dark tactical gear swept into the room, their weapons lowered, but ready, their eyes scanning the small space to instantly assess the threat level. They were followed immediately by three men and one woman wearing crisp, dark windbreakers. Emblazoned across the back of the jackets in bold, unmistakable yellow lettering were the acronyms of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Marshals Service. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The federal agents did not yell or brandish their weapons wildly. Their sheer presence, their absolute authority commanded the space entirely. They formed a solid, impenetrable wall of federal law enforcement between my family and the exit. For a moment, pure confusion washed over my father's face. He looked at the bold yellow letters on the jackets, his mind struggling to process why the highest levels of federal law enforcement were currently occupying a dirty, corrupt local precinct. Then the confusion morphed into a sudden, blinding outrage. Thomas Wilson was a man who believed his wealth made him immune to the law, and he instinctively reverted to his usual arrogance. He assumed this was a massive, unprecedented raid on the corrupt local police department, and he was deeply offended that he and his golden child had been caught in the crossfire. "What is the meaning of this?" Thomas bellowed, stepping forward and thrusting his chest out. He completely ignored the tactical gear and the federal badges, puffing himself up to intimidate the agents the same way he intimidated local contractors. "I demand to know who is in charge of this operation. You are interfering with a private legal matter. I am Thomas Wilson, and this is my daughter, a candidate for the state senate. We are currently conducting private business with our legal counsel, and you are violating our constitutional rights." One of the FBI agents, a tall man with a stern, uncompromising face, stepped slightly forward, placing himself directly in my father's path. He did not say a single word. He simply raised a hand, a silent, powerful gesture instructing Thomas to step back immediately. My father bristled at the dismissal. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the small, confined space. "I have the governor on speed dial. I fund the campaigns of half the judges in this district. If you do not lower those weapons and get out of this room right now, I will personally see to it that every single one of you is standing in an unemployment line by tomorrow morning. I want to see your supervisor immediately. Chelsea, emboldened by her father's aggressive stance, stepped out from behind him. She smoothed the front of her white pantsuit, attempting to project the polished, authoritative aura of a seasoned politician. She plastered a deeply fake composed smile onto her face. Officers. There has obviously been a massive misunderstanding here, Chelsea said, using her bright, captivating campaign voice. We are merely victims of circumstance. We were brought into this precinct because my estranged sister here is dealing with some very severe personal issues. If you are conducting a raid on this local department for corruption, we fully support your efforts. But we are private citizens, and I have a very important campaign luncheon to attend. You need to let us leave this building right now. Arthur, the defense attorney, tried to salvage his own situation. He stepped forward nervously, holding up his hands in a gesture of surrender. I am simply retained legal counsel, he stammered quickly. I was called in to facilitate a routine booking for a traffic incident. I have absolutely nothing to do with whatever local corruption investigation you are executing today. I would like to exercise my right to leave the premises. They all stood there completely and utterly convinced of their own false narratives. My father believed his money could buy federal compliance. My sister believed her political charm could grant her immunity. The lawyer believed he could simply walk away from a federal conspiracy by claiming ignorance. They looked at the wall of federal agents waiting for apologies, waiting for the path to clear, so they could walk out the door and resume their lavish, untouched lives. They had absolutely no idea that the federal raid was not targeting the local police department. They had no idea the raid was targeting them. I sat silently in my metal chair, my wrists still chained to the table, watching their monumental arrogance blind them to their impending destruction. The stage was perfectly set for the final curtain to fall. The heavy silence stretched for another agonizing second before my father decided he had endured enough of this perceived disrespect. He drew himself up to his full height, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with a sharp, indignant tug. He was entirely accustomed to men in uniform bowing to his commands, and he clearly intended to put these federal agents in their place. Thomas stepped firmly out of the interrogation room and into the corridor, planting himself directly in front of the tall FBI agent who had silently ordered him to step back. "Do you hear me talking to you?" Thomas barked, his voice echoing sharply down the barren concrete hallway. "I am not some local thug you can push around. I am Thomas Wilson. My daughter is a candidate for the state senate. We have absolute immunity from this local circus. You are going to step aside, clear a path to the garage, and let us leave this facility right now. Or better yet, since you are already here, you can do your jobs and process her." Thomas turned and pointed a stiff, accusing finger directly at me as I sat quietly at the metal table. He looked back at the federal agents with a sneer of supreme authority. "She is a criminal," he declared loudly. "She committed a felony hit-and-run last night, and she just confessed to it in this room. If you want to make an arrest today, you arrest her. Hand her over to your local counterparts, or take her into federal custody, I do not care. Just get her out of my sight and get out of my way before I make a phone call to the governor and have every single one of your badges stripped." Chelsea stepped out into the hallway to stand beside our father, crossing her arms and looking at the federal agents with a bright, condescending smile. "My father is completely right, officers," Chelsea added smoothly. "My sister is deeply disturbed and highly dangerous. We brought her here for her own good, but she is becoming uncooperative. We would really appreciate it if you could just process her paperwork so we can get back to our scheduled events. The press is waiting for me across town, and I really cannot afford to be late because of her little tantrum." Arthur, the defense attorney, remained cowering in the corner of the interrogation room. He clutched his leather briefcase to his chest, his eyes darting frantically between the heavily armed agents and his wealthy, arrogant clients. He knew something was fundamentally wrong, but Thomas and Chelsea were too blinded by their own narcissism to see the steel trap closing around them. The tall FBI agent did not flinch. He did not reach for his radio, and he certainly did not apologize for the inconvenience. He stared at my father with an expression of absolute terrifying indifference, the kind of look reserved for a minor pest that was about to be exterminated. "Are you deaf?" Thomas roared, his face flushing a violent shade of red as the agent continued to stare right through him. I told you to arrest her. I want your name and your badge number right now. The lead federal agent finally moved. But he did not reach for his badge and he did not address my father. He stepped smoothly around Thomas, completely ignoring the furious real estate developer, as if he were nothing more than a piece of cheap furniture. The agent walked right past Chelsea, erasing her condescending smile, and stepped into the small gray interrogation room. Two United States Marshals followed closely behind him, their tactical boots making a heavy, deliberate sound on the linoleum floor. Thomas spun around, his mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock as the agents bypassed him entirely. "What do you think you are doing?" he demanded, stepping back into the doorway. The lead agent stopped right in front of the scratched metal table. He reached into his dark windbreaker and pulled out a small silver key. He did not look at my father. He looked directly down at me. His stern, uncompromising face softened into an expression of profound professional respect. He reached down and slid the key into the heavy metal cuff securing my right wrist to the table ring. The lock clicked open with a sharp metallic snap that seemed to echo endlessly. The agent pulled the heavy steel bracelet away from my bruised skin, letting it drop to the table. He took a respectful step backward, perfectly squaring his shoulders, and clasped his hands professionally in front of his chest. He stood at absolute attention, quietly waiting for my instruction. "The courthouse is secure, Your Honor," the lead agent said, his deep voice carrying clearly across the room. "Warrants have been executed, the perimeter is locked down, the suspect vehicles have been seized, and the operation is under federal control. You are clear to stand." The silence that followed those words was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs in the split second after a bomb detonates right before the shockwave hits. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his arm still partially raised from pointing at me. Chelsea stared at the federal agent, her eyes wide and blank, her brain completely failing to process the phrase he had just spoken. "Your Honor." The words floated in the cold, sterile air, completely incomprehensible to the people who had spent the last 5 years treating me like garbage. I placed my freed right hand on the surface of the metal table and slowly pushed my chair back. The harsh scraping sound echoed loudly against the concrete walls. I stood up. I did not rush. I took my time, rolling my shoulders back and letting my spine straighten to its full commanding height. I brushed a small piece of lint off the front of my faded blue dress, shedding the terrified, hunched posture I had maintained for the past 24 hours. I looked at my family, my face a mask of cold, judicial authority. The pathetic, broken daughter they thought they had dragged into this room was entirely gone. Thomas opened and closed his mouth several times, resembling a fish suffocating on dry land. "What did he just call you?" my father whispered, the sheer crushing weight of reality finally beginning to crack his arrogant facade. I took a deliberate step around the metal table, moving gracefully toward the center of the room. I looked directly into my father's horrified eyes, then shifted my gaze to my sister, who was now trembling uncontrollably. "Allow me to formally reintroduce myself," I said, my voice steady, powerful, and ringing with absolute clarity. "For the past 5 years, while you assumed I was failing at a low-level desk job, I was actually building a career in the federal justice system. My name is Whitney Wilson. I am the Honorable Judge Whitney Wilson of the United States District Court. And every single one of you in this room is currently under federal arrest for a massive, heavily documented criminal conspiracy that you proudly confessed to on my hidden federal wire." Thomas stared at me, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the impassive federal agents flanking the open doorway. He looked like a man who had just stepped blindly off a steep cliff and was hovering in midair, desperately waiting for gravity to take effect. Chelsea simply stopped breathing, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently against the pristine white fabric of her designer coat. Arthur, the slick defense attorney, shrank further back into the corner of the room, silently praying to become completely invisible to the federal law enforcement officers blocking his only exit. The lead FBI agent stepped forward with quiet purpose and placed a thick, heavy manila folder directly onto the scratched metal table. I rested my hand flat against the cardboard cover, feeling the immense weight of their complete destruction beneath my fingertips. "You spent the last 5 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a massive failure," I said, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute authority in the small gray room. You cut me off completely because I refused to spend my life protecting the financial interests of corrupt corporations at that law firm. You assumed that because I walked away from a corner office, I had walked away from the law entirely. I slowly opened the heavy folder, folding the cover back to reveal the thick stack of documents inside. But I did not drop out of anything. I transitioned into high-level federal prosecution. I spent years taking down the exact kind of white-collar criminals you do business with every single day, Thomas. My conviction rate was absolutely flawless, and my strict dedication to the law resulted in a fast-tracked appointment to the federal bench. I have been a sitting United States District Judge for over a year, a fact you would have easily discovered if you had bothered to check on your daughter even once in half a decade. My father let out a choked guttural sound, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. His brain was finally processing the magnitude of his fatal error. He had not just framed a random civilian. He had attempted to extort a federal official. Instead of getting to know me, I continued pulling a thick stack of printed transcripts from the folder and tossing them onto the metal table. You relied on your own arrogant assumptions. You assumed I was a desperate, broke, pathetic alcoholic who could be easily intimidated by a forged piece of paper. And because you believed your own lies so completely, you invited a federal judge wearing a covert surveillance wire into your home, into your private country club gala, and into this very interrogation room. You wore a wire. Thomas gasped, the reality of his own recorded confessions finally crashing down on his shoulders. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. I captured every single word, I confirmed, coldly, tapping my finger against the top page of the transcripts. I recorded you admitting to bribing Chief Miller with $25,000 in cash from Chelsea's campaign discretionary fund. I recorded you detailing your extensive plan to suborn perjury. And most importantly, I recorded you bragging about forging my signature on the title documents for that luxury SUV. I pulled a separate, brightly colored document from the folder and slid it toward him. The United States Attorney's Office pulled the digital metadata on your little insurance fraud scheme early this morning. We have the exact timestamp of the forgery, and we have the sworn testimony of the notary you paid to falsify the official stamp. Your pathetic attempt to frame me for a felony is currently sitting on the desk of a federal prosecutor as a textbook case of criminal conspiracy. Chelsea finally found her voice. It was a weak, pathetic squeak that barely resembled her usual commanding tone. "You cannot do this to me," she whimpered, tears of genuine panic spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her flawless makeup. "I am your sister, Whitney. Jason and I were just trying to protect the campaign. We were just trying to survive the scandal. Do not even mention Jason to me." I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip across the sterile room. I reached into the folder and pulled out a series of high-resolution glossy photographs, spreading them out across the table like a winning hand of poker. Your brilliant campaign manager paid a visit to my apartment yesterday afternoon. He threatened to release fabricated evidence to the press if I did not sign this fraudulent confession today. I then proceeded to empty a bag of cheap liquor bottles across my kitchen counter to stage a crime scene. I tapped my finger hard against the glossy image of Jason standing in my kitchen, holding a bottle of vodka with a smug smile on his face. Jason was entirely unaware that my federal security detail installed microscopic high-definition cameras in every single room of my residence. We have crystal-clear video and pristine audio of his entire extortion attempt. A team of United States Marshals is currently dragging him out of your campaign headquarters in handcuffs as we speak. Chelsea let out a loud, ragged sob, pressing her trembling hands against her mouth. The flawless political candidate was rapidly dissolving into a terrified, helpless child right in front of my eyes. But I was not finished. The most devastating piece of evidence was still waiting inside the folder. "But the hit and run was always the missing piece of the puzzle," I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms against the cold metal table. I looked directly into Chelsea's tear-filled eyes, offering zero sympathy. "I kept asking myself why you were driving alone on that dark coastal highway in the middle of a torrential rainstorm. You never drive yourself after drinking at public events. You always have a hired driver, or you have Jason take the wheel. So what was so incredibly urgent that you had to speed away into the freezing night completely by yourself?" I pulled the final document from the folder. It was a printed transcript of the conversation I had recorded in the VIP corridor of the country club. I slid it across the metal table until it bumped gently against the fraudulent confession Arthur had presented to me just minutes ago. "I followed you last night, Chelsea," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "I stood right outside the executive suite while you and Jason had a panicked, desperate meeting with Harrison Cole." My father's head snapped up instantly. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror at the mention of the corporate CEO. He knew exactly who Harrison Cole was, and he knew exactly what kind of illegal, highly lucrative business the man conducted behind closed doors. "You were not just driving drunk when you hit David." I continued, watching my sister physically shrink away from the table, her entire body shaking. "You were speeding away from a secret meeting with an illegal corporate donor. You had a briefcase sitting in the back seat of that silver SUV containing $250,000 in untraceable cash. It was a direct illegal bribe to guarantee that you would destroy the new coastal zoning regulations the moment you took your Senate seat." The absolute silence in the room returned heavier and infinitely more suffocating than ever before. Arthur let out a small, terrified whimper from his corner. The defense attorney knew that just being in the room while these massive federal charges were laid out made him a potential accessory to a scandal that would make national headlines. "You did not leave that innocent man bleeding in the street because you were scared of a simple traffic scandal," I said, my voice ringing with total, unyielding condemnation. "You left him to die because stopping for the police would have exposed a $250,000 federal bribery scheme. You traded a human life for a briefcase full of dirty money." I stood up straight, closing the empty manila folder with a sense of profound finality. I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, worthless, and utterly disposable. They were entirely broken, permanently stripped of their power, their wealth, and their arrogant illusions. "You thought you were framing a disposable scapegoat," I concluded, looking at my father one last time as the federal agents moved into the room with handcuffs drawn. "You had absolutely no idea you were handing a federal judge the exact weapons required to dismantle your entire empire." The words hung in the air, heavier than the concrete ceiling of the interrogation room. The lead federal agent did not hesitate. He gave a sharp nod to the two United States Marshals standing by the doorway. They moved forward with practiced, terrifying efficiency. The metallic rattle of heavy-duty handcuffs being drawn echoed sharply against the bare walls. Thomas did not fight them. The aggressive real estate tycoon was completely paralyzed. He offered no physical resistance, as a marshal grabbed his suit jacket, spun him around, and forced his arms behind his back. The loud ratcheting of the steel cuffs, locking around his wrists, severed his connection to reality. He did not yell or demand his lawyer. He simply stared blankly at the scratched metal table, his jaw slack, trapped in a silent, defeated horror. He watched his entire empire and his untouchable legacy evaporate into thin air. Arthur, the slick defense attorney, was desperately trying to make himself invisible in the corner. He clutched his leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. He averted his eyes, severing his professional loyalty to save his own skin. A sudden commotion drifted down the barren hallway outside. The heavy footsteps of more federal agents grew louder, accompanied by the frantic shrieking of a familiar voice. Two FBI agents appeared in the doorway. They were dragging my mother, Susan, down the corridor. Right behind her, Jason was being marched forward by another team of heavily armed agents. His hands were shackled securely behind his back, and his custom-tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. His usual arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a cornered animal. The agents pushed Susan toward the doorway so she could see inside the room. She stumbled forward, her designer heels catching on the uneven linoleum floor. She looked at my father, her husband of nearly 40 years, standing in handcuffs like a common street criminal. Then her wide, terrified eyes landed directly on me. I was standing tall and completely unbound, the thick manila folder of damning federal evidence resting casually under my hand. One of the marshals standing next to my father looked at Susan and calmly recited the official charges. He stated clearly that she was being detained for conspiracy to commit federal fraud, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. The words hit her with the brutal force of a physical blow. Susan let out a short, ragged gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. Her eyes rolled back into her head, the whites showing starkly against her perfectly powdered skin. Her knees completely buckled beneath her. She collapsed toward the hard linoleum floor in a heavy, dramatic heap of emerald green silk. The federal agents did not scramble to catch her. They simply stepped back and allowed her to hit the ground with a dull thud, completely unimpressed by her theatrical swoon. She lay there entirely unconscious, her diamond necklace sparkling under the harsh fluorescent lights. The final curtain had dropped violently on her desperate, lifelong performance of high society perfection. With our parents completely neutralized, and Jason staring at the floor in silent terror, the crushing reality of the situation finally slammed into Chelsea. The golden child, the ruthless political rising star, the woman who had happily left a bleeding father on the wet asphalt completely shattered. The marshal assigned to her stepped forward, reaching out with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs to grasp her arms. Chelsea violently recoiled, pressing her back against the cold concrete wall and sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest, her expensive white pantsuit wrinkling on the dirty precinct floor as she began to sob. It was not the pretty manufactured crying she used for campaign cameras and donor sympathy. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical wail of absolute uncontrollable panic. The sound bounced off the bare gray walls, a sharp contrast to the absolute silence of the federal agents observing her breakdown. "Whitney, please!" Chelsea screamed, her voice cracking painfully as she looked up at me from the dirty linoleum. The heavy mascara she had carefully applied for her campaign luncheon was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. "You cannot let them do this to me. I am your sister. We share the exact same blood. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to a federal prison. Please just tell them to stop. Tell them it was all a big mistake." She reached a shaking hand out toward me, her manicured fingers grasping desperately at the empty air. "I will drop out of the race," she babbled, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush of desperation. "I will give you whatever you want. I will publicly apologize to you in front of the entire state. I will transfer all my campaign funds to you. I will buy you a beautiful house. I will make sure Dad gives you half the real estate company. Just please, Whitney, remember our family loyalty. You have to protect me. You promised you would protect me." She was actually begging. She was invoking the sacred concept of family loyalty, a concept she had gleefully weaponized, twisted and discarded whenever it suited her own selfish ambitions. She was trying to buy her way out of federal prison using the exact same arrogant tactics that had landed her in this interrogation room in the first place. I walked slowly around the edge of the scratched metal table, my flat shoes making no sound against the floor. I stopped just a few feet away from where she was cowering in the corner. I looked down at her, searching my own heart for even a single ounce of pity, regret, or residual sisterly affection. There was absolutely nothing. The emotional ties that bound me to this toxic family had been burned to ash the moment they tried to force me to sign that fraudulent confession. I slowly leaned forward, bending my knees slightly and resting my hands on my thighs, so my face was perfectly level with hers. I looked deeply into her terrified, tear-streaked eyes. The frantic sobbing hitched in her throat as she waited for my response, desperately hoping her pathetic display of vulnerability had somehow pierced my judicial armor. I kept my facial expression entirely blank, my voice dropping to a soft, cold, incredibly precise whisper that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. "Who is a jury going to believe?" I asked, mirroring the exact cruel insult she had hurled at me just minutes earlier with absolute devastating precision. "The Honorable Judge of the United States District Court, or the disgraced corrupt politician sitting on the floor of a dirty police station?" Chelsea stared at me, the last remaining shred of her hope extinguishing instantly. She opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. "Who is going to believe you anyway?" I whispered, delivering the final fatal blow to her massive ego. The marshal reached down, grabbed her tightly by the arms, and pulled her roughly to her feet. Chelsea offered no physical resistance as the heavy steel cuffs were ratcheted around her wrists, binding her hands securely behind her back. She simply wept, a continuous hollow sound that echoed off the barren walls of the interrogation room. My father Thomas stood rigidly next to her, his face locked in a mask of pale, suffocating shock. He looked at me one final time, perhaps searching for a glimmer of the obedient, terrified daughter he had dominated for over 3 decades. Finding only the cold, unyielding stare of a federal judge, he finally lowered his eyes to the scuffed linoleum floor. The lead FBI agent gestured toward the open doorway, instructing his team to initiate the transport. The marshals guided Thomas and Chelsea out into the corridor, forming a tight, heavily armed perimeter around them. I followed closely behind, walking beside the lead agent as we joined the rest of the federal task force. Down the hallway, two agents were assisting my mother. Susan had regained consciousness, but lacked the strength to walk independently. She was being physically supported by the officers, her expensive emerald green gown dragging on the dirty floor, her diamond necklace hanging askew. Jason walked ahead of her, his head tucked low between his shoulders, entirely stripped of the slick, aggressive confidence he had wielded in my apartment just 24 hours ago. The procession moved slowly through the empty, silent precinct. We passed the abandoned booking desks, the empty holding cells, and the deserted administrative offices. The corrupt local police force had completely vanished, leaving my family entirely isolated in the hands of the federal justice system. The very building my father had purchased with his corrupt campaign donations had become the staging ground for his total ruin. We approached the heavy double doors leading to the main entrance. Through the thick glass panes, the bright mid-morning sunlight filtered into the dim lobby. As we neared the exit, Chelsea suddenly stopped dead in her tracks, her expensive heels digging into the floor mat. A new, distinct wave of terror washed over her tear-stained face. She looked at Jason, who had also paused, his eyes widening in sudden realization. They both remembered the schedule. Chelsea had orchestrated a massive press event for 11 o'clock this morning. She had instructed Jason to invite every major local news network, every influential political blogger, and every prominent newspaper photographer to the precinct. The original plan was a masterpiece of political manipulation. She was supposed to walk out of these doors as the supportive, tragic sister, offering a tearful statement about family struggles while confirming my fabricated guilt. She had wanted maximum media coverage to boost her polling numbers right before the primary election. The federal agents did not care about her sudden hesitation. The marshals firmly pushed her forward, forcing her toward the glass doors. Chelsea began to thrash weakly against their grip, shaking her head in a desperate, frantic denial. She begged them to take her out through the back alley, pleading to be loaded into a vehicle inside the underground garage. She explained that the media was waiting outside, that her entire campaign was standing on the front steps. The lead FBI agent simply ignored her frantic pleas. The agents would not reroute secured transport merely to shield a candidate from waiting cameras. There would be no back doors today. There would be no secret exits to preserve their dignity. The agents pushed through the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the crisp, bright morning air, dragging my shattered family directly into the blinding spotlight they had so greedily demanded. The moment the heavy glass doors swung open, the atmosphere outside erupted into absolute chaos. A massive crowd of reporters, camera operators, and journalists had gathered behind a line of metal barricades set up along the precinct steps. They had their microphones raised and their cameras perfectly focused, expecting to capture the polished, smiling face of the future state senator. Instead, they were greeted by the shocking sight of a heavily armed federal tactical team. A split second of profound, stunned silence rippled through the press pool as they processed the scene. Then a tidal wave of camera flashes exploded. The rapid, blinding burst of white light illuminated the concrete steps like a strobe light. The quiet anticipation instantly transformed into a deafening roar of overlapping shouts and frantic questions. Reporters shoved against the metal barricades, thrusting their recording devices forward. They screamed my sister's name, asking why she was in handcuffs. They shouted at my father, demanding to know if his real estate company was under federal investigation. They called out to Jason, asking about campaign finance violations. The media professionals who had spent months writing glowing profiles about Chelsea's flawless political rise were now documenting her absolute humiliating downfall. The camera lenses zoomed in, capturing every devastating detail of their public execution. They photographed Chelsea's smeared, ruined makeup and her wrinkled designer coat. They captured Thomas looking completely broken, his arrogant posture replaced by a defeated, shameful slouch. They documented Susan weeping uncontrollably, her elite socialite facade entirely stripped away. The flashbulbs popped relentlessly, permanently etching their disgrace into the public record. Chelsea tried to turn her face away from the cameras, burying her chin into her chest, but the marshals kept her moving at a steady, unforgiving pace down the concrete steps. 3 large black federal SUVs were parked in a tight line at the bottom of the precinct steps, their engines idling with a low, powerful hum. The federal agents moved with practiced efficiency, opening the heavy reinforced doors of the vehicles. Thomas was the first to be loaded. A marshal placed a hand on top of his head, guiding the untouchable real estate tycoon into the caged back seat of the lead SUV. Susan was gently but firmly placed in the second vehicle, still weeping hysterically as the door slammed shut on her elite social standing. Jason was shoved in next to her, completely silent, his political career entirely extinguished. Finally, the marshals guided Chelsea toward the third vehicle. She stopped right before the open door, turning her head to look back up the concrete steps. Her tear-filled eyes met mine one last time through the blinding barrage of camera flashes. The absolute despair radiating from her face was undeniable, but I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, heavy satisfaction of true justice. The marshal pushed her downward, forcing her into the back seat and slamming the heavy door shut, cutting off her view of the world she used to rule. I stood at the top of the precinct steps, the crisp morning wind blowing my hair back, watching as the 3 federal vehicles pulled away from the curb. They drove down the street in a synchronized line, their sirens silent, but their presence absolute, carrying my toxic family away to face the federal prison sentences they had earned. I turned around and walked back into the precinct to process my statement, leaving their entirely shattered legacy behind me on the cold steps. The glass doors closed behind me, shutting out the deafening roar of the press. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was remarkably calm. Paul Henderson was waiting for me near the front desk, holding a thick stack of formal witness statements. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously documenting every single detail of the extortion attempt, the forged vehicle registration, and the illegal campaign donations. I did not write with anger or vindictiveness. I wrote with the cold, precise clarity of a federal judge executing the law. By the time I finished signing my name to the final document, the local news channels were already broadcasting the footage of my family being loaded into federal vehicles. I stood in the break room of the precinct watching a small television mounted in the corner. The breaking news banner flashed in bright red letters across the bottom of the screen. Prominent real estate developer and state Senate candidate arrested in massive federal corruption sweep. The local anchors were practically tripping over their words, trying to deliver the explosive details to the eager public. They showed the footage of Chelsea crying uncontrollably as she was shoved into the back of the dark SUV. The image played on a continuous loop, completely erasing her carefully crafted persona of political invincibility. It was a stunning visual representation of absolute failure, broadcast directly into the living rooms of every single voter she had so desperately tried to manipulate. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. Within 3 hours of the arrests, the state political party held an emergency press conference to completely disavow Chelsea. The very same politicians who had clinked expensive champagne glasses with her the night before now stood solemnly at a wooden podium and forcefully condemned her horrific actions. They announced that all party funding for her campaign was immediately suspended and demanded she officially withdraw from the state Senate race by the end of the business day. But the political excommunication was just the beginning of her nightmare. The federal prosecutors did not hold back any punches. They released a highly detailed indictment to the public, outlining the horrific timeline of her brutal hit-and-run, right alongside the massive bribery charges involving Harrison Cole. The public reaction was swift and merciless. The voters who had previously supported her progressive platform were absolutely disgusted by the revelation that she had left a bleeding father on the wet pavement simply to protect an illegal corporate payout. Chelsea was denied bail during her initial arraignment hearing. The federal magistrate rightfully cited her extreme flight risk and her proven willingness to ruthlessly obstruct a criminal justice investigation. She was forcefully stripped of her power and forced to trade her tailored white pantsuits for a standard-issue scratchy orange jumpsuit. The woman who had repeatedly treated me like a disposable speed bump was now sitting in a tiny freezing concrete cell, facing up to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. To make matters even worse, Jason flipped on her immediately. The slick campaign manager signed a sweeping cooperation agreement with the federal prosecutors before the sun even went down, offering to testify against Chelsea to significantly reduce his own prison sentence. He sold her out without a single second of hesitation, proving that there is zero loyalty among thieves. While Chelsea was learning the incredibly harsh realities of federal lockup, my father was watching his entire prestigious real estate empire rapidly disintegrate before his very eyes. Thomas had spent 4 decades building a massive fortune by bullying independent contractors, paying off corrupt local officials, and leveraging his aggressive personality to totally dominate the regional housing market. He firmly believed he was entirely too big to ever fail. The federal government decisively proved him wrong before dinner time. While he was sitting in a sterile interrogation room furiously demanding to speak to the governor, heavily armed teams of FBI agents were executing sweeping search warrants at his towering corporate headquarters downtown. They walked right past his terrified receptionists, carrying stacks of empty cardboard boxes, and seized every single computer hard drive, financial ledger, and secure filing cabinet in the entire building. The financial ripple effect was absolutely devastating. The moment the news officially broke that Thomas Wilson was facing serious federal charges for systemic fraud and bribery, his wealthy corporate investors panicked. Major banks immediately halted his massive lines of credit, effectively bankrupting his active projects. Construction sites across the state ground to an abrupt halt as builders realized they were never going to get paid for their labor. The United States Attorney's Office filed an emergency motion to instantly freeze every single one of his personal and business assets, actively preventing him from transferring his hidden wealth to secure offshore accounts. The arrogant man who had proudly told me I had absolutely nothing to lose was suddenly stripped of everything he had ever owned. His private bank accounts were locked, his luxury properties were seized by the government, and his flawless professional reputation was completely pulverized. He could not even afford to hire the elite defense attorneys he had so proudly bragged about utilizing just 1 day prior. He was formally assigned a heavily overworked public defender, a junior lawyer, who looked at him with the exact same thinly veiled contempt he had always shown to his blue-collar employees. His complete financial ruin was swift, brutal, and entirely of his own making. He would spend the rest of his miserable life tied up in endless, exhausting litigation, frantically fighting to hold on to tiny scraps of a hollow legacy that simply no longer existed. He was a completely broken man who had proudly orchestrated his own utter demise because he wrongly assumed he was smarter than the law. My mother faced an entirely different kind of profound destruction. Susan was the only member of the criminal conspiracy granted bail due to her lack of prior criminal history and her secondary supporting role in the cover-up. But her physical freedom was entirely superficial. She was allowed to return to the massive stone estate, but she returned to a sprawling house that felt exactly like an empty tomb. The federal agents had torn the place completely apart during their meticulous search, leaving her pristine imported marble floors scuffed and stained with muddy tactical boot prints. But the physical mess was absolutely nothing compared to the total social annihilation she rapidly experienced. Susan had spent her entire adult life ruthlessly climbing the competitive ranks of the local elite, using her immense wealth and my sister's political rising star to secure her unshakable position at the very top of the social hierarchy. She thrived on exclusive country club lunches, lavish charity galas, and the envious, admiring glances of her wealthy peers. That glamorous world vanished overnight. when she desperately tried to call Margaret Davis, the powerful senator's wife, who had offered her so much mock sympathy at the gala. The call went straight to a disconnected line. Her supposedly loyal wealthy friends quickly blocked her personal number. The elegant women who had fawned over her just 24 hours ago now actively crossed the street to deliberately avoid being photographed anywhere near her presence. The final crushing blow came the following morning when a private courier delivered a formal certified letter to the estate. The prestigious Oak Ridge Country Club had officially revoked her exclusive lifetime membership, citing a strict morality clause buried deep in their bylaws. Susan was left completely alone, aimlessly wandering the empty, echoing halls of her giant mansion. She had no powerful husband to hide behind, no golden child to proudly parade around town, and absolutely zero friends willing to associate with a disgraced, convicted felon. She was a total social pariah, permanently trapped in a gilded, luxurious cage of her own making. The household phone stopped ringing entirely. The fancy embossed invitations stopped arriving in the mail. The cold, silent isolation she had happily subjected me to for 5 long years was now her permanent, inescapable reality. The flawless, elegant facade she had spent her entire life cultivating had collapsed, leaving nothing but absolute empty ruin in its devastating wake. She had willingly traded her own daughter for a shiny plastic crown that completely shattered the second she finally dropped it on the hard marble floor. The intense, agonizing silence of her giant empty house served as a constant, bitter reminder of the beautiful family she had eagerly destroyed to protect a lie. Now she had absolutely nothing left but the ghosts of her mistakes to keep her company. She had lost her status, her wealth, her power, her beloved golden child, and the absolute last shred of her dignity, all in a single devastating afternoon. Her perfect world had finally been burned straight to the ground. The ashes were all that remained of the toxic legacy they had built. The reign of terror was officially completely and permanently over. I took a deep breath, letting the profound finality of the incredible moment settle completely over my shoulders. I had survived their horrific cruelty, and I had ultimately returned it with absolute undeniable justice. I slowly turned off the television in the precinct break room and walked out of the police station, stepping proudly into the crisp afternoon air, finally entirely free of their control forever. The massive mountain of legal paperwork took several exhausting hours to complete, but every single signature I placed on those federal documents acted as a permanent seal on my family's fate. Over the next several weeks, the full crushing weight of the United States justice system finally descended upon the Wilson estate and the Apex Industries conglomerate. The federal prosecution was completely and utterly relentless. Because the bribery and fraud charges were so deeply intertwined with Thomas's corporate accounts, the federal government initiated immediate asset forfeiture. They did not just freeze his bank accounts. They systematically liquidated his real estate holdings, selling off the luxury properties and commercial developments he had spent decades acquiring through intimidation and deceit. The millions of dollars generated from these seizures were not simply absorbed by the government. The prosecutors, working in tandem with the court, established a massive restitution fund specifically designed to compensate the victims of my family's extensive corruption. And at the very top of that list was the man Chelsea had left bleeding on the dark coastal highway. 2 months after that chaotic morning on the precinct steps, I drove back to the same sprawling trauma center where I had first discovered the horrifying truth of my sister's actions. The harsh, freezing rain of that terrible night was long gone, replaced by the bright, warm sunshine of an early spring afternoon. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, no longer needing to hide my face or skulk in the shadows. I took the elevator up to the rehabilitation wing, my footsteps light and purposeful against the polished linoleum floor. I stopped outside a private sunlit corner room and gently pushed the heavy wooden door open. David was sitting upright in a specialized medical bed propped up by thick white pillows. His injuries had been catastrophic, and he still wore a heavy brace around his chest and a cast on his left leg, but the color had finally returned to his face. He was awake, alert, and smiling. Sitting right next to his bed, holding his hand with gentle, unwavering devotion, was his elderly mother. And curled up at the foot of his bed, coloring in a bright picture book, was the little girl I had seen crying in the intensive care waiting room. When I stepped into the room, David looked up, his eyes widening slightly with curiosity. He did not know who I was. He only knew that the driver who hit him had been caught, and that a massive federal investigation had somehow stemmed from his tragic accident. I introduced myself simply as Whitney, and explained that an independent federal court had finalized the restitution process in his case. I did not tell him I was the sister of the woman who nearly killed him. That toxic connection belonged entirely to the past, and I refused to bring Chelsea's dark shadow into this space of healing. I pulled a thick official envelope from my briefcase and handed it to his mother. I explained that the federal government had finalized the liquidation of the primary defendant's assets. I told them that a multi-million-dollar settlement had been irrevocably placed into a secure trust in David's name. The funds were more than enough to cover the absolute best medical care years of top-tier physical therapy and every single living expense they could possibly encounter while he recovered. Furthermore, a dedicated educational trust had been established for his daughter, guaranteeing that her college tuition and future financial stability were permanently secured. The elderly woman opened the envelope with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the official federal documents. When she saw the final settlement number, she let out a loud, breathless gasp, pressing her hands against her mouth as tears of profound relief flooded her eyes. She stood up and wrapped her arms around my shoulders, weeping with a pure, unadulterated gratitude that stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the manufactured, manipulative tears my family had always utilized. David reached out and gently squeezed my hand, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked me for giving him his life back. Looking at the genuine love and unbreakable bond shared by this small, resilient family, I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my soul. They had faced unimaginable tragedy, yet they clung to each other with a fierce, authentic devotion. It was the exact kind of unconditional love I had spent my entire childhood desperately searching for in the cold, cavernous halls of my parents' mansion, only to finally realize it had never existed there at all. I left the hospital that afternoon with a remarkably light heart, driving back toward the downtown judicial district. The towering federal courthouse stood like a fortress of white stone and glass against the blue sky, a powerful symbol of the justice I had dedicated my life to upholding. I parked in my reserved subterranean spot and rode the private elevator up to the restricted judicial floors. As I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward my chambers, the familiar atmosphere of the building enveloped me. It was a space defined by solemn duty, rigorous intellect, and absolute integrity. My staff greeted me with warm, respectful smiles, completely unbothered by the media storm that had briefly surrounded my name when the indictments were first unsealed. They knew exactly who I was, and they respected the quiet, relentless determination I brought to my courtroom every single day. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my private chambers and stepped inside. The room was expansive and quiet, lined with towering bookshelves filled with thick leather-bound legal volumes. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the large arched windows, casting a warm golden glow across the rich Persian rug. I walked slowly across the room and stood behind my grand mahogany desk. I ran my fingers lightly along the smooth, polished edge of the wood, feeling the solid, grounding weight of my accomplishments. I took my seat in the high-backed leather chair, resting my hands comfortably on the armrests. I looked out the window at the sprawling city skyline, finally allowing myself to fully process the massive permanent shift in my reality. For 35 years, I had allowed my family's cruel, dismissive narrative to dictate my internal worth. I had allowed their constant rejection to make me feel small, invisible, and utterly inadequate. Even after I walked away from their toxic world, I had secretly carried the heavy burden of their disapproval, constantly wondering if I would ever be enough to earn their love. But sitting here in my federal chambers, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my own strength, that burden completely evaporated. I realized with absolute clarity that their approval was never a prize to be won. It was a poison designed to keep me compliant. My father's wealth, my mother's social standing, and my sister's political ambitions were nothing more than a fragile house of cards built on a foundation of lies and extortion. They had spent their entire lives projecting an illusion of power, while I had spent the last 5 years quietly building actual, unshakable power in the dark. I had forged my character in the fires of their rejection. I had built a life defined by unwavering integrity, public service, and a fierce dedication to the truth. True success was never about meeting the impossible shifting expectations of a family that only valued me as a convenient scapegoat. True success was sitting at this mahogany desk, knowing I had the courage to look the most powerful corrupt people in the eye and hold them absolutely accountable for their actions, even when those people shared my own blood. I was no longer the family dropout. I was no longer the tragic disappointment. I was the Honorable Judge Whitney Wilson, and I was finally, completely and unapologetically free. Thank you for listening to my story today. The journey to healing from toxic family dynamics is rarely easy, and it often requires us to make devastatingly difficult choices to protect our own peace. But if my experience can offer any comfort, let it be the absolute certainty that you do not have to accept the terrible narrative your abusers have written for you. You have the power to step out of their shadow and build a life of authentic success on your own terms. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, justice, and personal triumph. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own integrity, or watched someone face the long overdue consequences of their own cruel actions? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comment section below. Remember that your worth is never determined by the people who failed to appreciate you, and your greatest strength is often built in the quiet moments when no one else is watching.